Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never intended to become someone who believes in cryptids. I was just a normal guy with a normal life until we moved to our house outside Columbia, New Jersey, back in the summer of 2011. We got a great deal on the place, probably because it's pretty isolated, sitting right on the edge of the Delaware Water Gap. Behind us is nothing but thick woods, hills that slope up away from the house, and a small creek that cuts through the trees about 50 yards back. The previous owners had installed this massive picture window in the living room that looks out over the backyard. I guess they liked bird watching or something. Little did I know that window would become my portal to something I still can't fully explain. It first happened about 6 months after we moved in. It was a Wednesday night in January, around 10 o'clock. I remember because I was watching a basketball game, sitting on the couch with just the TV light illuminating the room. My wife had already gone up to bed. It was one of those cloudy winter nights, no moon, just darkness beyond the window glass. I was half paying attention to the game when something caught my eye outside. At first I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a deer walking along the tree line. We get plenty of those around here. But this was different. This was moving upright, and it was massive. I turned my head to look directly at the window, and that's when I saw it clearly, a huge figure walking upright past the window, maybe 20 yards away by the edge of our yard where it meets the forest. It had this dark, matted hair all over its body. Not fur like a bear, but hair like human hair, only longer and coarser. The moonlight wasn't great, but I could make out its silhouette against the slightly lighter background of the field. The thing that struck me most was the width of its torso and shoulders. I'm not a small guy. I played football in college and still lift weights regularly, but this thing made me look like a child in comparison. It must have been at least 4 feet wide across the shoulders, and tall. God, it was tall. I'd estimate at least 9 feet, maybe more. It just walked past, not looking toward the house, moving with this strange but smooth gait. Not lumbering like you'd expect from something so big. It was almost graceful in a weird way. I froze completely, didn't even think to grab my phone for a picture. I just sat there, heart pounding, wondering if I was seeing things. Then, about 5 minutes later, it came back, walking in the opposite direction, following the same path. This time I got a slightly better look at its profile. The arms were long, too long. They hung down almost to its knees, and its neck was weirdly short, like its head was just sitting on those massive shoulders. After it disappeared into the darkness, I finally remembered to breathe. I got up and locked all the doors, checked on my wife who was sound asleep, and then sat up half the night with a baseball bat nearby, wondering if I should call someone. But who do you call when you see something like that? The police would think I was drunk or crazy. The next morning, I went out to check the yard. The ground was partially frozen, but I could see some indentations in the mud near the tree line. They were spaced far apart, much wider than a human stride, but I couldn't make out clear footprints. I told myself it was probably just a bear, walking oddly. I almost convinced myself of that for a while. For about a year, I didn't see it again. I'd occasionally hear strange noises from the woods at night. Not normal animal sounds, but low, rumbling grunts and heavy footsteps that made the small ornaments on our shelves vibrate slightly. Sometimes branches would snap loudly in the middle of the night, much louder than what a deer or even a bear would cause. But I didn't see the figure again, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined it. Then, in the winter of 2012, it happened again. Almost identical circumstances, late evening, minimal moonlight, me alone in the living room. This time I was reading a book with just a small lamp on. The movement caught my eye again, and there it was, following the same path along the tree line. This time, I was slightly more prepared mentally. I put my book down slowly and just observed. Its hair was dark brown, almost black, and uneven in length across its body, longer on the shoulders and upper back, shorter on the limbs. The way it moved was deliberate, but completely comfortable in the darkness, like it knew exactly where to place each foot without looking. As it walked past, I could see the muscles in its back and legs shifting under the hair. This was no guy in a suit. The movement was too natural, too fluid for that. I didn't tell my wife about either sighting. What was I supposed to say? Hey, honey, I think Bigfoot is using our backyard as a shortcut. But about 3 months after my second sighting, my son Matthew came to visit. He's in his 20s, lives about 2 hours away, and was staying the weekend. Saturday night, I went to bed early with a headache, while Matthew stayed up watching a movie in the living room. Around 1 in the morning, he came bursting into our bedroom, white as a sheet. He was shaking, literally trembling as he told us what he'd seen. He said he was sitting on the couch when something huge walked past the window. But unlike my experiences, this time the creature had stopped and turned toward the house. Matthew said it actually looked in at him through the window for a few seconds before continuing on. The way he described it matched exactly what I'd seen: the height, the build, the hair. But he got a better look at the face than I ever had. He said though the face was covered with hair, he could see lighter colored skin underneath around the mouth and nose area. The mouth and nose were distinctly visible, though he couldn't make out the eyes clearly in the darkness. He told us it gave him a sick feeling in his stomach, not just from fear, but from the certainty that he was looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist. That night, with Matthew still visibly shaken, I finally told them both about my previous sightings. My wife thought we were pulling some kind of elaborate prank on her at first, but she could see the genuine fear and confusion on our faces. Matthew kept saying, "Dad, that was a Bigfoot." I know it sounds crazy, but that's what it was. Over the next few years, we collected more evidence, though never anything definitive enough to convince skeptics. After heavy snowfalls, we'd find widely spaced footprints crossing our property, sometimes measuring 18 inches in length with a stride of over 5 feet. They'd always follow the same basic path. From the northeast corner of our property, along the tree line past the picture window, and then toward the creek before disappearing into the denser woods. The vocalizations became more common too. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like wood knocking, 3 distinct taps, followed by silence, then 3 more. Other times, especially on summer nights with the windows open, we'd hear these low, rumbling calls from deep in the forest that would be answered by similar calls from further away. Nothing a coyote or other known wildlife would make. I've spent hours researching Bigfoot sightings online, and many aspects of our experiences match other accounts. The Delaware Water Gap area, with its extensive forests, rivers, caves, and hills, provides the perfect habitat for something like this to remain hidden. The creek that runs through our property likely serves as a travel corridor for it, allowing it to move through the area while staying close to water and cover. I've only told a handful of people about what we've seen. Most react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. A couple of friends have stayed overnight hoping to see it themselves, but the creature seems to know when strangers are present. It never shows itself on those nights. Last summer, I decided to set up a trail camera facing the path where we usually see it. Within 3 days, the camera was gone, ripped right off the tree where I'd secured it with heavy-duty straps. The straps weren't cut, they were torn apart. Whatever took it had incredible strength. The most recent sighting happened just 2 weeks ago. I was taking out the trash around 9 at night when I heard heavy footsteps coming from the woods. I froze by the garbage cans and watched as the familiar figure emerged from the trees. This time, it was carrying something, what looked like a deer carcass slung over one shoulder, holding it with just one hand like it weighed nothing. It moved swiftly across the edge of our property, never looking my way, and disappeared into the darkness. What strikes me most about our experiences is that despite dozens of sightings over the years, the creature has never shown any aggression toward us. It's aware of our presence. It clearly saw Matthew that night, and I suspect it knows when I'm watching it through the window, but it just goes about its business. It's almost like we've developed an unspoken agreement. We don't bother it, and it doesn't bother us. I've measured our window height and done some calculations based on the sightings. If the windowsill is 5 feet from the ground and the creature's head was clearly visible above it when it looked in at Matthew, then accounting for the distance from the house, this thing has to be at least 9 feet tall. Its proportions are all wrong for a human. The arms too long, torso too wide, and that oddly short neck that makes its head look like it's set directly on its shoulders. Sometimes I wake up at night and just stare out at the darkness, wondering if it's out there, watching our house. I wonder if it has a family. If there are more of them in these woods, I wonder how they've managed to stay hidden for so long in a state as densely populated as New Jersey. I don't know what to do with this knowledge. I've thought about contacting researchers or TV shows that investigate this kind of thing, but I don't want our peaceful property turned into a circus. And selfishly, I worry about property values. Who wants to buy a house that's regularly visited by Bigfoot? So for now, I just keep watching. Every night when it's dark and quiet, I find myself drawn to that picture window, scanning the tree line for movement. My wife thinks I'm obsessed, and maybe I am. But how do you just go on with normal life when you know something extraordinary is happening in your own backyard? The thing that keeps me up at night isn't fear anymore. It's the question of how many other people have seen what I've seen, but kept quiet for the same reasons I have. How many other creatures are out there that we've convinced ourselves don't exist because the alternative is too uncomfortable to accept? I don't have answers, just a window that looks out on a world that's turned out to be much stranger than I ever imagined. Story 2. I still can't shake what happened to me up on the Peace River back in June of 2009. I'm not someone who scares easily either. I've been fishing and camping solo across BC for 20 plus years, and I've had my share of wildlife encounters, bears, wolves, you name it. But what I experienced there, it was something else entirely, something I can't explain away no matter how hard I try. I'd been planning this trip for months, found this perfect little spot about 40 miles north of any real civilization, way up the river where hardly anyone goes. You have to take logging roads to even get within hiking distance, the kind of pristine fishing that's getting harder and harder to find these days. It took me nearly 4 hours of driving on increasingly rough roads, then another hour and a half hiking with all my gear before I reached the spot I'd picked out from satellite images. A beautiful clearing about 20 yards back from the riverbank, sheltered by a stand of old-growth pines with easy access to the water. Perfect place to set up base camp for a week of fishing. The river was running high that year from the spring melt, crystal clear and cold. First day was absolutely perfect. Weather was good, fishing was even better. Caught 3 decent-sized rainbow trout within the first couple hours, cleaned them right there by the water, and had the best dinner I could ask for, cooked over my little camp stove. I remember feeling so at peace, sitting there watching the sunset over the mountains, thinking this was exactly why I do these solo trips. Just me, the wilderness, and not another human being for miles. That first night was uneventful. Slept like a rock in my tent, woke up refreshed. Second day was more of the same. Fantastic fishing, beautiful scenery. But that second night, something changed. I was sitting by my small fire after dinner when I first noticed it. Sounds from across the river. Not the normal forest sounds I'm used to. This was different, deliberate, like something large moving through the underbrush. but trying not to make noise. The hair on my arms stood up, but I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear, nothing to worry about. I added another log to my fire and tried to shake the feeling that something was off. That night I didn't sleep well, kept waking up thinking I heard something. Twice I could have sworn I heard what sounded like wood knocking against wood from across the river. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination running wild. The third day I fished further upstream, almost a mile from my camp. Had decent luck, but couldn't shake this growing sense of unease, like I was being watched. Every time I looked across the river to the dense forest on the other side, I got this overwhelming feeling that something was there, tracking my movements. That night, the feeling intensified. I kept my fire going longer than usual, finding comfort in the light. Around midnight, I heard it clearly, 3 distinct knocks from across the river, followed by what I can only describe as a low grunt. Not a bear, not an elk. Something else, something I'd never heard before. I barely slept at all that night. By the 4th morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I'm an experienced outdoorsman, not some city slicker jumping at every forest sound. I decided to head down to the river early, hoping the peaceful routine of fishing would calm my nerves. I got to the riverbank around 6:30. The morning mist was still hanging low over the water, giving everything this dreamlike quality. The river was about 50 feet across at that point, running fast, but not dangerously so. I started casting, trying to focus on the rhythm of it, rather than the persistent feeling of being watched. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a dark shape, partially obscured by the tree line across the river, something massive moving slowly between the trees. I froze, my fishing rod suspended mid-cast. As I stood there, barely breathing, it stepped forward to the edge of the trees. Jesus Christ. I'm still struggling to describe what I saw. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. Not a bear standing on its hind legs. This thing was bipedal, standing upright like a man, but not a man, not even close. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, matted in places, especially around what I'd call its shoulders. And those shoulders, they were impossibly wide, like a bodybuilder but bigger, with proportions that just looked wrong on a bipedal creature. Its arms hung down abnormally low, almost to its knees. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders, without much of a neck that I could see. The face was partially shadowed, but I could make out lighter skin around the eyes, and what must have been its nose. The eyes, I couldn't see them clearly from that distance, but I could feel them locked onto me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other across the river. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking. I couldn't move, couldn't even think straight. Everything I thought I knew about wildlife in these forests was suddenly thrown into question. Then it moved again. Deliberately, it bent down and picked something up from the ground. A rock, a big one. It must have weighed at least 20 pounds, but this thing lifted it like it was nothing. With a motion that was disturbingly human, it drew back its arm and hurled that rock with incredible force. The rock didn't hit me. It wasn't even close, but it splashed violently into the river about halfway between us. Water sprayed up 6 feet high. Message received loud and clear. Before I could even process what was happening, it bent down again. This time it picked up an even larger rock, had to be 30 pounds at least. Again, it threw it with frightening strength and accuracy. This one landed closer to my side, maybe 15 feet from where I stood. I finally snapped out of my frozen state and started backing away from the riverbank, never taking my eyes off the creature. That's when it picked up a third rock and threw it. This one hit the shoreline just a few feet from me, sending dirt and pebbles flying. 3 rocks, 3 warnings, each one closer than the last. I dropped my fishing rod and backed away further toward my camp. The creature didn't cross the river, but it moved along its bank, partially hidden by the trees now, but always visible enough that I knew exactly where it was. I could hear it making these low, rumbling grunts. Occasionally there would be a heavy thumping sound, like it was striking a tree or the ground. When I reached my campsite, I didn't hesitate. I started packing up as fast as I could, constantly glancing toward the river. The creature was still there, watching. I could see it moving back and forth along its side of the river, not threatening exactly, but territorial, like it was patrolling a boundary. That's when it hit me. It wasn't trying to attack me. It could have crossed that river if it wanted to. It was warning me, telling me to get out of its territory. Those rocks weren't random. They were deliberate messages, each one saying, "Get closer to leaving or I'll get closer to you." I've never packed up camp so quickly in my life. Didn't even bother with neatness, just stuffed everything into my backpack as fast as I could. All the while, I could feel those eyes on me. Occasionally, I'd hear another grunt or wood knock, reminders that I was being watched, that I needed to hurry. As I hoisted my pack and prepared to leave, I took one last look across the river. The creature had moved slightly downstream, but was still visible. It was standing more openly now, as if making sure I could see its full size. It raised one massive arm and brought it down hard against a tree trunk, making a sound that echoed across the water. One final warning. The hike back to my truck was a blur. I didn't stop once, didn't look back, just moved as fast as I could with a full pack. My mind was racing the entire time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I could rationalize away. I got to my truck, threw my gear in the back, and just sat there for a while, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the nearest ranger station and report what I'd seen, but I knew how it would sound. I knew the questions they'd ask, the looks they'd give, so I just drove home. It's been 14 years since that day on the Peace River, and I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. They think I'm exaggerating or that it was a bear. But I know what I saw. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. This was something else entirely. I've done a lot of research since then. Read accounts from others who've had similar experiences. The height, the proportions, the territorial behavior. It all matches up with what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I never believed those stories before, thought they were campfire tales or misidentifications. Now, I don't know what to believe. What I do know is that whatever I encountered that day wasn't trying to hurt me. It could have easily crossed that river if it wanted to. Instead, it chose to warn me away, to establish a boundary. It was saying, "This is my territory, and you need to leave." And I listened. I haven't been back to that spot since. Haven't gone solo camping anywhere nearly as remote either. Some nights, I still wake up hearing those wood knocks in my dreams, or seeing that massive silhouette at the edge of the trees. Some things change you forever, and my encounter on the Peace River is one of them. I still fish, still camp, but I'll never look at the deep forests of British Columbia the same way again. Story 3. It was late May, during a full moon. I was 23 years old and living in a small town in northern Washington state. I'd recently returned from Vietnam and was staying with my uncle while trying to figure out what to do with my life. Sleep wasn't coming easy in those days. Too many memories, too much noise in my head. So I developed a habit of taking late-night walks to clear my mind. That particular night was unusually warm, the kind of perfect spring evening that makes you feel alive again after a long winter. I'd wandered down to the edge of Pinewood Golf Course, a small 9-hole place that backed up against national forest land. During the day, it was nothing special, just a modest local course where retirees played rounds and teenagers worked summer jobs. But at night, empty and bathed in moonlight, it became something else entirely. Peaceful, silent, except for nature. I didn't actually go onto the course itself. Didn't want to risk getting caught trespassing. Instead, I found a comfortable spot just inside the tree line where I could see out across the fairway of the seventh hole. The full moon was incredible that night, so bright you could almost read by it. The entire clearing was washed in this silvery blue light that made everything look slightly unreal. I settled down with my back against a pine tree, lit a cigarette, and just sat there listening to the night. There was a small lake about 50 yards to my right that fed into a larger one beyond the course, and the frogs were putting on quite a concert. Spring peepers, bullfrogs, all of them going at once in this amazing natural symphony. In the distance, I could hear an occasional owl. Time sort of slipped away as I sat there. Could have been 20 minutes, could have been an hour. I wasn't wearing a watch, and back then I didn't carry anything like a phone that would tell time. I was just existing, breathing, not thinking about the war or my uncertain future or anything else. Just there in that moment. That's when I first heard it. At first, I thought it might be a deer, something large moving through the underbrush deeper in the forest behind me. Nothing alarming. I'd seen plenty of wildlife on these nighttime excursions. But then I realized whatever it was seemed to be moving deliberately. Not the stop-and-start motion of a foraging deer, but a steady progression toward the edge of the woods where I was sitting. The sound grew louder, branches breaking, leaves rustling, but heavier than any deer I'd ever encountered. My first thought was maybe a black bear. We had them in the area, though they weren't common. I slowly reached for my pocket knife. Not that it would do much good against a bear, but it was the only thing I had. The frogs suddenly went silent, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. That's when I felt the first real tingle of fear run up my spine. In nature, when everything goes quiet at once, it usually means a predator is nearby. I stayed completely still, barely breathing as the sounds grew closer. Whatever it was now only about 30 yards away and moving directly toward where I sat. I considered making a run for it across the golf course, but something told me to stay put. Don't move. Don't make a sound. The moonlight was bright in the clearing, but under the canopy where I sat, the shadows were deep. I was wearing dark clothes, jeans, and a navy sweatshirt. If I didn't move, I thought, maybe whatever was approaching wouldn't notice me. 20 feet away now, I could hear heavy breathing, not panting like a dog, but deep, rhythmic breaths, human-like, but bigger somehow. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt this primal sense of wrongness wash over me. Whatever was coming toward me wasn't something I was supposed to see. And then the branches about 30 feet to my left began to move. Not just rustle, but bend and part. Something massive was pushing through them. I'll never forget what happened next as long as I live. A shape emerged from the thicker growth of trees and stepped into a patch of moonlight that broke through the canopy. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, so tall, at least 7.5 feet, maybe 8, and broad. Not fat, but powerfully built with wide shoulders that tapered to a narrower waist. But what hit me hardest was that it was walking upright, perfectly upright on 2 legs, like a man, but not a man. Its entire body was covered in dark fur or hair. In the moonlight it looked black, but it might have been dark brown. The fur wasn't shaggy like a bear's, but shorter and more uniform, almost sleek in places. Its arms hung longer than a human's would, nearly to mid-thigh. I could see massive hands with what looked like opposable thumbs. Its head sat directly on those powerful shoulders without much of a neck, and from my angle I could make out a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. My mind raced through explanations, a bear standing upright, a man in some kind of costume, but I knew immediately that neither was right. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. This was a creature perfectly at home in its body, moving with purpose and confidence through the forest. It strode quickly into the small clearing between the denser trees, heading toward the golf course. Its gait was smooth but strange. a longer stride than a human would take, with a slight roll to the shoulders. I remained frozen, not even daring to blink, hoping against hope that it would just continue on its path and never notice me sitting there. Then my worst fear happened. When it was about 20 feet into the clearing, it suddenly stopped, completely still, like it had heard something, or sensed something. Me. It had sensed me. In one fluid motion, it turned its entire body and looked directly at where I sat. Even though I was in shadow, those eyes found mine instantly, like it had known exactly where I was all along. I still couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked onto mine. Time seemed to stop in that moment. My lungs burned from holding my breath. My heart pounded so hard I was certain the creature could hear it. We stared at each other across that small clearing for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Its eyes caught the moonlight, just a brief reflection, but enough for me to see they were dark, intelligent, and undeniably focused on me. Not animal eyes. There was something behind them, something that understood exactly what I was and was making calculations. Then it did something that turned my blood to ice. It tilted its head slightly to one side, almost like a curious dog might, but the gesture was disturbingly human, deliberate, like it was trying to figure me out. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but some deeper, more primitive part of my brain knew that running would be the worst possible thing I could do. This was a predator. If I ran, it would chase. After that eternal moment of eye contact, the creature straightened its head and let out a sound I'll never forget. Not a roar or a scream, but a deep, guttural grunt that seemed to come from deep in its chest. It wasn't particularly loud, but in the silent night, it might as well have been a thunderclap. It was a sound of acknowledgement, recognition, like it was saying, I see you, and I'm choosing to let you see me. Then, without any sign of fear or hurry, it simply turned away and continued forward, disappearing into the trees on the other side of the small clearing, heading toward the golf course. I remained frozen for what must have been 5 minutes, straining to hear where it had gone. In the distance, I heard more branches moving, growing fainter as the creature moved away from me. The chorus of frogs slowly resumed, first one brave caller, then others joining in, until the normal sounds of the night returned. When I finally felt certain it was gone, my body began to shake uncontrollably, not just trembling, but violent shaking that I couldn't stop. The delayed terror flooding through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, even in combat. I stayed there, back pressed against that tree, for another hour at least, too afraid to move, too afraid to make the journey back to my uncle's house. When I finally did get up, my legs were so wobbly I nearly fell. I took a different route home, staying in open areas and under streetlights, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't sleep at all that night, or much for the next week. The next morning I went back in daylight. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints maybe, or broken branches. There were some snapped twigs and disturbed undergrowth, but nothing conclusive. Nothing I could take to anyone as proof of what I'd seen. I never told my uncle. I tried to tell a buddy once, years later, after too many beers. But I could see the disbelief in his eyes and quickly played it off as a joke. The few times I've mentioned anything about it, I've always downplayed what happened, saying I thought I saw something strange in the woods once, keeping it vague. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. And it wasn't my imagination. That thing saw me, really saw me, and chose to let me go. Sometimes I wonder if it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Other times, I wonder if it knew exactly what it was doing, deliberately revealing itself for reasons I'll never understand. I've read about Bigfoot encounters over the years. Most people describe feeling terror, and I certainly felt that, but there was something else too. A strange sense of significance. Like I'd been granted a glimpse of something most people never get to see. Something that exists alongside us but separate from our world. That night changed me forever. I've never felt completely at ease in the woods since then, especially after dark. Not because I'm afraid of seeing it again, though that's certainly part of it, but because I now know with absolute certainty that our understanding of the world is incomplete. There are things out there that shouldn't exist according to science, but they do. I'm an old man now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Never wanted to, but sometimes when I hear about other sightings, I feel this strange connection to those people. We're members of a club nobody asks to join, people who've had the ground shift under their feet as they realized the world is stranger and more mysterious than we're taught to believe. I still don't know what it was. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some unknown species. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for one brief moment, our worlds intersected under a full moon beside a golf course in 1970. And nothing has ever been the same since. Story 4. I've never told this story to many people. When you experience something so terrifying and unexplainable, sometimes it's easier to just try to forget it happened, but I can't. January 1982 changed how I see the woods forever. Me, Dale, and Mike had been friends since elementary school. We grew up in this little town on the Olympic Peninsula where there wasn't much to do except fish, hunt, and get into trouble. By the time we were in our mid-20s, we were experienced outdoorsmen, or at least we thought we were. That night in January, we decided to do some night fishing on the Bush River. It was stupid cold, probably in the high 30s, but the steelhead run was supposed to be good. The river was running high from all the winter rain, not ideal conditions, but we were stubborn. We parked Mike's old Ford pickup about a quarter mile from our favorite spot, grabbed our gear and the 2 Coleman lanterns we brought for light, and hiked down to the riverbank. The moon was just a sliver that night, and the forest around us was pitch black. All we could hear was the rush of the swollen river and the occasional hoot of an owl. Our spot was this massive fallen cedar that stretched about 15 feet into the water. We'd been fishing from it for years. It was perfect because it got us out away from the bank where the deeper channels ran. We set up the lanterns on the log, one at the bank end and one about halfway out, and got our lines in the water. For the first couple hours, nothing much happened. We caught a couple small trout that we threw back, drank some beers, and bullshitted about work and women troubles. The usual stuff. By about 1 in the morning, I was starting to think about calling it a night. My fingers were numb, and my ass was frozen from sitting on that damn log. That's when everything went to hell. I remember I was in the middle of rebaiting my hook when there was this deafening crack sound, like someone had set off dynamite. The water about 10 feet in front of us just exploded upward. I'm not exaggerating. A wall of freezing river water shot up at least 6 feet high and came down on us like someone had dumped a bathtub overhead. "What the fuck?" Dale shouted, nearly falling off the log. The lantern closest to the end of the log got knocked over and went out, plunging half our spot into darkness. Before any of us could even process what had happened, there were 2 more massive crack sounds, one right after the other. Another wall of water drenched us completely. My fishing rod was torn right out of my hands and disappeared into the river. Jesus Christ. Mike was on his feet now, slipping on the wet log. What the hell is that? That's when I saw it. A massive rock, I swear it was the size of a watermelon, flying through the air from the opposite bank of the river. It sailed over our heads and crashed into the water behind us with a huge splash. A second later, another one flew over and hit the water, closer this time. I froze. I remember my mind just couldn't process what was happening. Rocks don't just fly through the air on their own. Someone or something was throwing them. The 3 of us stared across the river. The remaining lantern cast just enough light for us to see the far bank, maybe 40 yards across the swollen river. There was a rocky ledge over there, about 10 feet above the water, and standing on it were two massive figures. I'll never forget what I saw. They were huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Their bodies were bulky, covered in what looked like dark fur or hair that moved slightly in the breeze. But it was their eyes that really got to me. In the faint light from our remaining lantern, their eyes glowed this weird turquoise-green color, like nothing I've ever seen on any animal. They were just standing there, swaying slightly, watching us. "Run," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "Fucking run!" We scrambled off that log so fast, I'm surprised none of us fell in. Dale grabbed the remaining lantern, which was a mistake because it made us a perfect target. As we stumbled toward the gravel bar that would give us a straight shot back to the truck, another huge rock slammed into the water just a few feet from where I was running. The splash hit me in the face and I could taste the silty river water as I gasped for breath. I remember looking back. I couldn't help myself. The figures were still there, one of them raising what must have been another rock. I couldn't see their faces clearly, just those glowing eyes and the massive silhouettes. Dale was ahead of me, holding the lantern high as we raced across the gravel bar. The rocks and sticks cut into my feet through my wet sneakers, but I barely felt it. Mike was right behind me, cursing under his breath. I could hear his labored breathing. Mike was a smoker and never could run worth a damn. "Don't look back," Dale shouted. "Just keep moving." But I heard another splash behind us, farther away this time. They were still throwing rocks, but their aim was off now that we were further away. We reached the forest trail that led back to the road, and that's when the real fear hit me. The trees were dense here, the trail narrow. Our single lantern cast weird, jumping shadows as Dale ran with it. Every shadow looked like one of those things, waiting to grab us. The quarter-mile back to the truck felt like 10 miles. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. I kept thinking I heard heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind us. But whenever I glanced back, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. We finally burst out of the trees onto the dirt road where Mike had parked the truck. Dale reached it first, yanking on the passenger door handle. "It's locked, you asshole," he screamed at Mike, who was fumbling with his keys, dropping them in the gravel. "I got it. I got it." Mike was shaking so bad he could barely get the key in the door. I was still staring back at the tree line, certain that any second those things would emerge from the darkness. The forest seemed alive, breathing, watching us. Finally, Mike got the door unlocked. We piled in, Dale practically in my lap in the passenger seat. Mike cranked the engine, threw it in reverse, and peeled out so fast we fishtailed on the gravel. We drove straight home, not stopping once. Nobody said a word the entire 40-minute drive. We were all soaking wet, freezing, and in shock. When Mike pulled up to my house, I just nodded at them and got out. We didn't even say goodbye. What was there to say? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my bathtub with the water as hot as I could stand it, trying to get warm again, but the chill seemed to have settled into my bones. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing turquoise-green eyes staring at me from across the river. The next day, Dale called, and we agreed not to talk about what happened. Mike was on the same page. We were grown men, and none of us wanted to sound crazy. We didn't go fishing for a couple months after that. When spring came around, we eventually went back to the Duca bush, but never at night and never to that same spot. We'd fish different areas, always in daylight and always with a nervous eye on the opposite bank. Something strange, though. Every now and then, when we'd be fishing those parts of the river, we'd catch this horrible smell. It's hard to describe exactly, but it was like wet dog mixed with sour cardboard. The first time it happened, about 3 months after the incident, Dale and I locked eyes immediately. We both knew. Mike claimed he couldn't smell anything, but I could tell by his face that he was lying. Over the years, I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Olympic Peninsula. Some of the descriptions match what we saw: the height, the build, even the rock-throwing behavior. But none of them mention those strange turquoise-green eyes. And honestly, I don't know if what we saw were Bigfoot or something else entirely. Dale moved to Arizona about 10 years ago, said he couldn't stand the rain anymore, but I think he just couldn't stand the forests. Mike still lives around here, but he doesn't go fishing much these days. When we do get together, we never talk about that night. It's like an unspoken agreement, but I still fish. Not as much as I used to, and never at night, but I go. Sometimes I think I'm trying to convince myself that I'm not afraid. Other times I think maybe I'm hoping to see them again, just to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. Last summer, I took my 12-year-old nephew fishing on the Duca Bush. Different spot, of course. While we were there, he asked me if I believed in Bigfoot. Apparently they'd been talking about it in school. I just shrugged and told him I didn't know. But later that day, as we were packing up to leave, I caught that smell again. Wet dog and sour cardboard. It was faint but unmistakable. My nephew didn't notice it, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hurried him back to the car, probably confusing him with my sudden urgency. As we drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the tree line along the river. There was nothing there, of course, just trees and shadows. But sometimes, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still see those eyes glowing in the darkness, and I hear the crack of rocks hitting water. I don't know what happened that night in January 1982. I don't know what those things were on the opposite bank, or why they started throwing rocks at us. All I know is that the Olympic Peninsula forests hold secrets, and some of them are watching us from the shadows. Story 5. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for years now. Part of me thinks nobody will believe it, and the other part just wants to get it off my chest. It's been almost 4 years, and I still have nightmares about it sometimes. My wife Jen and I were on this extended camping trip through Northern California. We'd been at it for almost 3 weeks, hopping from one campsite to another. We're both pretty experienced campers. Nothing hardcore, but we know what we're doing. We had our routine down solid by then. We'd set up camp, explore during the day, sometimes go into nearby towns for supplies or a hot meal, then come back and enjoy the quiet. This particular day, we'd spent all afternoon hiking, came back to our site to clean up, then decided to drive into Lewiston for dinner at this little place someone had recommended. Nothing fancy, just burgers and beers. We'd found this amazing spot by the Trinity River a few days before, secluded enough to feel private but not so remote that it felt dangerous. Or so I thought. We got back to our campsite around 10 that night. It was that perfect kind of dark you only get away from cities, where the stars are ridiculous and you need a good flashlight to see anything beyond 5 feet. I remember feeling relaxed from dinner, maybe a little tired, just looking forward to crawling into our sleeping bags. I parked, and when the headlights swept across our campsite, my stomach dropped. Our tent, this big 8-man dome we'd bought specifically for this trip, was completely knocked over. Not just collapsed, but literally pushed to the side with all our stuff scattered everywhere. My first thought was bears, which was scary enough. "What the hell?" I remember saying as I grabbed our big maglite from the glove box. Jen was already out of the truck, shining her phone flashlight at the mess. The weird thing was how the tent had been messed with. All our stuff was thrown around, but nothing seemed torn up or eaten, which made no sense for a bear. We'd been super careful about food too. Everything was locked in the truck or hanging from our bear bag a good distance away. I started picking things up, checking for damage, trying to make sense of it. The tent poles were bent in a way that didn't look like wind damage. Something with serious strength had pushed it over. Jen had gone back to the truck to grab our pillows that we'd taken with us to dinner. Jen has this thing about using her own pillow, even in restaurants. We always keep the more valuable stuff locked in the truck when we're away. I was busy trying to see if our sleeping bags were salvageable when I heard Jen's voice. "Steve, as fast as you can, please get to the car with the keys." Now, this might not sound alarming to anyone else, but years ago, we'd come up with this phrase as our emergency code. It meant serious danger, don't question, just move. We created it after a sketchy encounter with some drunk guys at a rest stop years ago. The sentence is normal enough that it wouldn't alert anyone nearby, but specific enough that we'd know exactly what it meant. I dropped everything immediately, didn't look around, didn't grab anything, just walked straight to the truck as calmly as I could. My heart was hammering, but I didn't run. Jen was already in the passenger seat, her face completely drained of color. The second I got in, she said, "Drive, now." I started the engine and pulled out, making a quick three-point turn on the narrow road. "What is it, someone watching us?" I asked once we were moving. She was trembling. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't human. Jen isn't the type to exaggerate or freak out easily. She's the calm one between us, always rational, always collected. Seeing her this shaken terrified me more than anything she could have said. "What do you mean?" I kept glancing between her and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. "I thought it was a deer at first," she said, still staring straight ahead. When I was putting the pillows in the truck, I looked over at where the headlights were shining, maybe 15 feet away, but then it stood up. My skin went cold. Stood up? On two legs. It was massive, Steve. Huge. It took a few steps toward the river, and I swear to God it walked like a person. She was hugging herself now. It had this brownish fur or skin, I couldn't tell exactly. I only saw it for maybe 3 seconds before I called you over. "A bear?" I suggested, though I knew that wasn't it. Bears don't really stand and walk like people, not for any distance. No, it had shoulders, arms, it moved. Wrong for a bear. She took a deep breath. "And the smell. Did you notice that smell?" I hadn't, actually, being too focused on the tent. But now that she mentioned it, there had been a strong, musky odor around the campsite. I'd assumed it was just river funk or something from the tent being knocked over. We drove 30 miles to Redding and checked into the first hotel we found. Neither of us talked much. Jen took a long shower while I channel surfed, trying to process what had happened. I kept telling myself there had to be a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew we'd encountered something not normal. The next morning, after a night of barely sleeping, we talked it over. Most people would probably just leave, head home and never look back. But there was something about not knowing, about leaving without understanding what happened, that bothered us both. Plus, all our camping gear was still scattered around the site, so we decided to go back, in daylight, with a plan to be out of there by noon at the latest. On the way, we stopped at a gas station and bought a disposable Kodak camera. This was before I had a decent camera on my phone, and we wanted to document whatever we found. Looking back, I'm glad we did, even though what we discovered only raised more questions. We arrived around 9 in the morning. Everything looked different in daylight, less threatening, more familiar. Our stuff was still scattered everywhere, but the fear from the night before had dulled slightly. We started collecting our things, working quickly and efficiently, constantly scanning our surroundings. Then Jen said, "Stand where I was standing last night." She positioned me where she'd been when she spotted the thing facing the river's edge. "Now raise your hand to where I saw its shoulders." I did as she asked, stretching my arm up as high as I could. I'm 5'11", and my reach was nowhere near where she indicated, not even close. Whatever she saw would have been at least 7 feet tall, possibly taller. "It was squatting when we first pulled up," she said quietly. "I think it was watching our campsite, and our headlights surprised it." The thought of something that size, observing our camp, waiting for us, made my skin crawl. I looked at the nearby trees for comparison. If Jen's estimate was right, this thing was massive, not just tall, but proportionally huge. "Let's look for footprints," I suggested, partly to keep us busy, and partly because I needed something concrete, something I could see with my own eyes. We started searching the area near where Jen had seen it. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and some patches of grass, not ideal for tracks. But as we expanded our search, heading toward a hillside about a quarter-mile from our camp, we found something. A trail. Not a hiking trail, but a path of disturbed vegetation and pressed down earth that seemed to lead up the hill. Following it carefully, we came across what were unmistakably footprints. Huge, human-like impressions in softer patches of ground. On the dirt road itself, we found one particularly clear print. I put my boot next to it for scale, and it was easily twice the size. But what really got me was the depth. The impression was about an inch deep in packed earth. I stood in the same spot and jumped up and down, and I barely left a mark. I weigh 150 pounds. Whatever made that print had to be significantly heavier. We used the disposable camera to take pictures of everything. The campsite, the comparison of my height to where Jen saw the shoulders, and about 20 different footprints showing various movement patterns. Some showed what looked like deliberate, careful steps, like it was trying to move quietly. The prints told a story. They came down from the hillside, circled our campsite, lingered in certain spots, particularly near where we kept our clothes and personal items, then headed toward the river where Jen had seen it disappear. As we followed the trail of prints, the musky odor got stronger in certain areas, especially where it seemed the creature had stopped for longer periods. It was an unmistakable smell, not like any animal I'd encountered before, earthy, but with something else mixed in, almost like wet fur combined with something sour. We spent about 2 hours documenting everything, then packed up what remained of our camping gear. The tent was a complete loss. Poles bent beyond repair, fabric torn in places, but honestly, I wouldn't have used it again anyway. Just as we were about to leave, I found something that sent a chill through me. Near where the prints headed toward the river, caught on a low bush, were several coarse, dark brown hairs, too thick to be human, too long to be from any common animal in the area. I carefully collected a few and put them in a Ziploc bag. The drive home was quiet. We kept looking at each other, having these silent conversations with our eyes. Did that really happen? What do we do now? Who would even believe us? When we got home, we developed the photos. They came out clear enough. The footprints especially were undeniable. The hair samples I collected sat in a drawer for months before I finally worked up the courage to send them to a lab for analysis. The results came back inconclusive. Unidentified primate species was the closest they got. I've replayed that night in my mind countless times. Sometimes I think we should have reported it to someone. Rangers? Police? But what would we say? Hey, we think Bigfoot ransacked our campsite. And to what end? I've read enough about people who report these things to know how they get treated, so we've mostly kept it to ourselves. We still camp occasionally, but never in that area, never for extended periods, and always with extra precautions. Jen refuses to camp anywhere that doesn't have other people nearby now. I don't know what we encountered that night near Lewiston. I don't know why it was interested in our campsite or our belongings. Was it curious, territorial? Just passing through? The questions haunt me sometimes. All I know is that something intelligent enough to investigate our belongings, strong enough to completely demolish our tent, and cautious enough to move away when discovered, was watching us. And sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, or I catch an unusual scent in the woods, I can't help but wonder if something's watching me again. Story 6. I've debated posting this for a long time. 8 years have passed, but I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night in Swiss, Missouri. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or make up stories for attention. I'm just a regular guy who experienced something I still can't explain. It was early April 5th, if I remember right. The weather was just starting to warm up after a long winter. My fiancée Sarah and I were settling in for the night, watching some forgettable TV show. We'd been in that house for about 2 years by then. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place backed up against a dense stretch of woods, but it was ours. We had a decent-sized yard where I kept a chicken coop with about 20 chickens, and my dog, Rex, a German Shepherd mix I'd had for 6 years. Around 9:30 that night, Rex started barking outside. Not his normal, "there's a squirrel" bark, but that deep, aggressive bark dogs make when they're genuinely alarmed. I muted the TV and listened. The barking continued, getting more frantic. "Probably those damn coyotes again," I told Sarah. We'd lost chickens to them before. I grabbed my Remington 870 shotgun from the gun cabinet and headed to the back door. Sarah looked worried but didn't try to stop me. She knew I needed to check things out. When I stepped onto the deck, the motion light clicked on, illuminating part of the yard. Rex was at the edge of the woods, hackles raised, barking like I'd never heard before. He wasn't charging into the trees like he normally would with coyotes. He was keeping his distance, which immediately struck me as odd. "Rex, come here, boy," I called, but he ignored me completely. Another red flag. That dog always listened to me. I scanned the tree line, and that's when I saw it. Something in the shadows just beyond where the light reached. I couldn't make out details, just a dark mass that seemed too big to be a coyote, much too big. It was partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, but I could tell it was tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet. My first thought was bear, but we didn't have bears in that part of Missouri, at least not commonly. The hair on my neck stood up. Whatever it was, Rex was terrified of it, but wouldn't back down. I raised my shotgun and fired a warning shot into the air. Usually that would scare off any wildlife, but the shadow didn't move. Rex's barking intensified. "Get out of here," I yelled, and fired another shot, this time into the ground near the tree line, still keeping a safe distance from where Rex was standing. That's when I heard it. The sound I still hear in my nightmares sometimes. It was like a freight train crashing through the woods, branches snapping, undergrowth being trampled, but moving faster than any human could manage through dense forest. Whatever it was big, and it was moving away fast. Rex chased after it for about 30 yards before stopping and returning to the yard, still barking but clearly relieved. I called him back to the house, checked the chicken coop, which was intact, and decided to chalk it up to a particularly large coyote or maybe even a loose dog from one of the neighboring properties. I didn't want to think about other possibilities. Sarah asked what happened, and I downplayed it, saying it was probably just a coyote I'd scared off, but that wasn't the end of it. 3 days later, I was coming home late from work. Must have been around midnight. I'd picked up an extra shift at the factory where I worked. Sarah was staying with her sister that night, so I was alone. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights swept across the chicken coop. Something looked off. I parked and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. When I approached the coop, my stomach dropped. There was a hole torn in the wire mesh, about 6 feet up from the ground. Not cut, torn, like something had just ripped through it. The hole was maybe 18 to 20 inches in diameter. Inside, there were feathers and blood everywhere. I counted the chickens. 5 were missing. What bothered me most was the height of the hole. Coyotes don't stand 6 feet tall, and they don't tear through wire mesh that easily. Whatever did this was strong and tall. I patched the hole as best I could with some spare fencing I had in the shed. Rex stayed close to me the whole time, unusually quiet and alert. I brought him inside with me that night, something I rarely did since he preferred being outdoors. He seemed grateful. I tried calling Sarah, but couldn't reach her. I didn't sleep much that night, kept thinking about what could have made that hole. I told myself it was probably raccoons. They're clever enough to climb up and maybe work together to tear an opening. But deep down, I knew raccoons wouldn't make a hole that big or take 5 full-sized chickens. The next night is when everything went to hell. Sarah was still at her sister's, so it was just me and Rex again. I double-checked the coop repairs before turning in around 11. I was exhausted from lack of sleep the night before and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up to Rex barking like a maniac. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. His barks were coming from outside. He must have scratched at the door until I let him out in my sleep, something I sometimes did without fully waking up. But these weren't regular barks. He sounded terrified and aggressive at the same time. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my shotgun, and ran to the back door. When I flipped on the porch light, I saw Rex at the chicken coop, facing something on the other side that I couldn't see from my angle. Then I heard it. A sound I can't really describe properly. It was like a howl, but mixed with a scream. Nothing like a coyote or wolf or any animal I've ever heard. It made my skin crawl. Low at first, then rising to a pitch that hurt my ears even from the distance of the house. As I was fumbling to get the door open, I saw the chicken wire start to tear again. Not from the previous patch job, but a new spot. The wire was literally being ripped apart by something with immense strength. I could hear the metal straining and popping. Rex, that brave, stupid dog, charged directly at whatever was on the other side of the coop. There was a blur of movement. And then, Jesus, I still have trouble believing what I saw. Rex was thrown through the air. Not jumped, not knocked back, but picked up and thrown like a damn rag doll. He flew about 20 feet before hitting the ground with a yelp that cut right through me. I was on the deck by then, shotgun raised. In the poor lighting, I could only make out a massive dark shape. It was hunched over, but still tall. Taller than me for sure. And I'm 6'1". It had moved away from the coop and was now between me and Rex, who was whimpering on the ground. I fired without hesitation. The blast lit up the yard for a split second, but I couldn't make out details, just a large, hair-covered form. I pumped and fired again, and again. 5 shots total, one after another, as fast as I could work the action on my shotgun. After the 5th shot, the thing took off toward the woods, making that same freight train sound from the first night, but louder, angrier. The crash of underbrush and snapping branches faded as it moved deeper into the forest. I ran to Rex, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. He was in bad shape. His side was torn open, ribs showing through, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. He was breathing, but each breath seemed to cause him pain. Blood was pooling underneath him. I carefully picked him up. He must have weighed 70 pounds, but adrenaline made him feel light and put him in my truck. The nearest emergency vet was 40 minutes away. I drove like a maniac, talking to Rex the whole time, telling him he'd be okay, even though I knew he probably wouldn't be. When I got to the vet clinic, the overnight staff took one look at Rex, and their faces told me everything. They did what they could, but his injuries were too severe. Multiple puncture wounds, 4 broken ribs, a shattered leg, and internal bleeding. The vet asked what had attacked him. I said I didn't know. I couldn't bring myself to describe what I'd seen. In the end, I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I held Rex as they put him down, feeling like I'd failed to protect him. I drove home in a daze as the sun was coming up. When I got back, I checked the chicken coop in the daylight. The damage was extensive, 2 large holes torn in the wire, and the wooden frame was partially splintered. Inside, more blood and feathers, and another 7 chickens gone. I spent the morning searching the woods for tracks or blood, anything that might explain what had happened. I never found clear footprints, just broken branches and disturbed ground where the thing had run off. No blood trail either, which meant I probably hadn't hit it. Or if I had, the wounds weren't serious enough to slow it down. Sarah came home that afternoon. I told her what happened, or at least a version of it. I said a large animal, possibly a bear, had attacked the coop and killed Rex when he tried to defend it. She knew bears weren't common in our area, but didn't push the issue. She could see how torn up I was about Rex. For weeks afterward, I kept the shotgun by my bed and jumped at every sound outside. I rebuilt the chicken coop with stronger materials, installed security lights around the property, and got a game camera. But whatever it was never came back, at least not that I could detect. To this day, I've never told anyone the full story. What would I say? That I think a Bigfoot killed my dog? That I fired 5 shotgun shells at some monster in my backyard? People would think I was crazy or making it up. I still live in that same house with Sarah, who's my wife now. We have 2 kids. Sometimes when I'm out in the yard at dusk, I feel like I'm being watched from the tree line. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Maybe not. I've never had another encounter like that night, but I still don't let our new dog stay outside after dark. Story 7. I've been holding this in for over 4 years now, and I think it's time I finally share what happened to me and my wife, Jen. I've read through so many similar accounts on here, and some of the details match up so closely with what we experienced that it's honestly freaking me out all over again. This happened on July 30th, 2019. The date is burned into my memory because it completely changed how I view the world around me. Jen and I had spent the afternoon at Serpent Mound. We're both into historical sites, and since we were visiting her parents in Cincinnati that week, we decided to take a day trip up to Adams County to check it out. It was around 4 in the afternoon when we were heading back, driving north on State Route 73. It was a beautiful day, clear skies, sun shining, perfect visibility. I remember because Jen had her window down and was commenting on how nice the weather was compared to the humidity we'd been dealing with the previous days. We were chatting about the mound, debating the theories about why it was built when we started approaching the bridge that crosses over Ohio Brush Creek. I was driving, doing about 45 miles per hour. I remember checking my speed because there had been a patrol car a few miles back. As we crossed the bridge, I happened to glance to my right, down toward the creek. At first, I didn't register anything unusual. Just caught a glimpse of what I thought were people by the water. My brain automatically categorized them as fishermen, and I almost looked away, but something felt off, and I did a double take. About 20 yards beyond the bridge, on the west bank of the creek, stood 2 enormous black figures, and I mean enormous. I'm 6'1", and these things towered over what my height would have been if I'd been standing there. I'd estimate 8 to 8.5 feet tall, easy. They were just standing there completely still, looking at the water. But what really caught my attention was a third, smaller figure that was standing ankle deep in the creek itself. This one was maybe the size of an 8 to 10-year-old kid, but had the same jet black appearance as the other 2. Now, I need to be clear about something. When I say they were black, I don't mean they were wearing black clothes. They were covered in what appeared to be black hair from head to toe, and their proportions were all wrong. The 2 larger ones had these impossibly broad shoulders and muscular builds, but their arms, their arms hung down almost to their knees. It wasn't right. Nothing about them was right. By this point, we were already past the bridge. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 3 or 4 seconds, given the speed we were traveling. I immediately hit the brakes, not screeching to a halt or anything dramatic, just slowing down enough that I could try to get another look in the side mirror. "What's wrong?" Jen asked, noticing how I'd tensed up. I couldn't even speak for a moment. I was trying to process what I'd just seen, while also trying to spot them again in the mirror. But the angle was wrong, and trees blocked the view once we'd passed a certain point. "Did you see those people by the creek?" I finally managed to ask. "What people?" she replied, turning to look out the back window. I wasn't looking. I struggled to find the words. There were these figures, 3 of them. They were all black, like covered in black hair, 2 huge ones on the bank and a smaller one in the water. She gave me that look, the one that says she thinks I'm messing with her. "Very funny, Cahill. I'm serious," I insisted. "They were right there, plain as day." I considered turning around. Part of me desperately wanted to confirm what I'd seen, to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. But another, more primal part of me was screaming not to go back. Something about those figures had felt deeply wrong, threatening even, though they hadn't made any aggressive moves. "Should we go back?" Jen asked, probably seeing the conflict on my face. I hesitated, then pressed the gas pedal again. "No," I said finally. Let's keep going. For the next several miles, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive and black following our car. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I've never experienced anything like the dread that settled over me in those moments. "You really saw something, didn't you?" Jen asked quietly after a few minutes of silence. I nodded. Yeah, I did. "What do you think it was?" I shook my head. "I don't know. They looked like... I don't even know how to describe it without sounding crazy. They weren't bears, definitely not. They were standing upright, completely bipedal, perfect posture, but they weren't human either. No clothes, all covered in hair, and just massive." The realization of what I might have seen started to dawn on me, but I couldn't bring myself to say the word out loud. It felt too absurd, too impossible. But the image of those three figures kept replaying in my mind, especially the smaller one in the water. Was it a juvenile? Were they a family group? The thought sent another chill down my spine. We stopped at a gas station about 20 minutes later. I needed to use the bathroom and splash some water on my face. As I stood at the sink, staring at my reflection, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe they were people in some kind of ghillie suits or hunting gear. But why would hunters be standing around like that? And why would one be in the water? It didn't make sense. When I got back to the car, Jen had been looking something up on her phone. "There have been sightings in this area," she said quietly, "of Bigfoot." And there it was, the word I'd been avoiding. I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Relieved that there was a name for what I might have seen. Terrified because accepting that possibility meant accepting that everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. "That's crazy," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" she challenged. "You've always been the most level-headed person I know. You don't make things up, and you're not prone to hallucinations. If you say you saw something, I believe you saw something." The rest of the drive back to her parents' place was tense. We discussed whether to tell anyone what had happened. Her parents would think we were joking, and my friends back home would probably suggest I'd had too much sun. In the end, we decided to keep it between us, at least for a while. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures, especially the two larger ones with their impossibly long arms and muscular builds. I kept thinking about how still they had been. They hadn't been moving around or gesturing like humans typically do when they're together. They were just watching, observing, and that smaller one in the water, what was it doing? Was it drinking, fishing, playing? I got up around 3 in the morning and searched online for Bigfoot sightings in southern Ohio. There were more than I expected, including several near the area where we'd been driving. One account from 2017 described a family seeing a large, hair-covered bipedal creature crossing Route 73 about 5 miles from the exact spot where I'd seen the three figures. Another person claimed to have heard unusual howling sounds near Ohio Brush Creek late at night. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd seen was real. These weren't just random stories. There was a pattern, a consistency to the descriptions that matched what I'd observed. The next day, I was a wreck. Jen's parents noticed something was off, but I blamed it on not sleeping well, which wasn't entirely untrue. Jen kept giving me these looks, silently asking if I was okay. I wasn't. Part of me wanted to drive back to that spot, to see if they were still there or if I could find any evidence, footprints, broken branches, anything. But the thought of actually encountering them again, maybe closer this time, kept me from suggesting it. We went home 2 days later, and I've spent countless hours since then researching cryptid sightings, particularly Bigfoot encounters. I've found myself going down rabbit holes, reading about government cover-ups, missing persons cases in national parks, and the strange phenomena that often accompany Bigfoot sightings, like unexplained lights or electronic malfunctions. None of it has given me any definitive answers, but it has convinced me that whatever I saw that day, I'm not the only one who's seen something similar. I still have questions that haunt me. Why were they just standing there in broad daylight? Were they aware we could see them from the road? Was the smaller one being taught something by the larger ones? And most troubling of all, how many times have I driven past something extraordinary without noticing it? Every time I'm in a wooded area now, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings in a way I never was before. That single moment, those few seconds of observation while crossing a bridge at 45 miles per hour, changed my entire perspective on what might be out there. I've never gone back to that specific spot on Route 73. Part of me wants to, but another part is afraid. Not just of what I might see, but of what I might not see. If I went back and found nothing, would that make me doubt my own memory, or worse? What if I did see them again? 4 years later, I still don't have any answers. All I have is what I saw. 3 jet-black hair-covered figures, 2 massive adults and 1 child-sized, by Ohio Brush Creek on a sunny July afternoon. No logical explanation, no closure. Just the unsettling knowledge that something exists in our world that defies conventional understanding. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know they were real, and I know they're still out there, somewhere in the forests of Ohio, going about their lives while we humans remain largely oblivious to their existence. I haven't told many people about this. Honestly, I was afraid of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking, but after reading so many similar accounts here, I felt compelled to share my experience. If nothing else, maybe it will help someone else who's seen something they can't explain feel less alone. I still drive with one eye on the woods these days. Some things you just can't unsee. Story 8. I've been holding this in for a long time, but after reading so many similar accounts here, I feel like I need to share my own experiences. I've had 2 encounters with what I believe was Bigfoot in Northern California, and they've completely changed how I view the wilderness. The first happened back in April of 2000. My buddy Mel and I were spending the weekend up in Humboldt County near Whitepeck. We'd been panning for gold and fishing most of the morning, not having much luck with either, but enjoying being outdoors after a long winter. It was around noon when Mel suggested we explore Bald Hills Road a bit, just to see what was up there. The weather was perfect that day, not too hot, not too cold. I remember the sky was incredibly blue, with just a few clouds. We had Mel's old Ford pickup, which wasn't the most reliable vehicle, but it handled the mountain roads okay. Bald Hills is this winding road that zigzags up from the Klamath River into these heavily forested mountains. We'd only made it a few turns up when Mel suddenly slammed on the brakes. "Ed, look over there," he said, pointing toward a stand of trees about 50 feet off the road. At first, I couldn't see what he was pointing at. Then I noticed movement, something large and dark standing among the trees. My first thought was that it was a man, maybe a hunter. Then I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but as I stared longer, I realized it didn't quite match either description. This thing was man-shaped, but different. It wasn't particularly tall, I'd guess less than 6 feet, but it had this stocky build that made it look powerful. Its arms seemed longer than a human should be, and it was covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur. The hair wasn't matted or patchy, like you'd expect from a bear with mange or something. It was uniform all over its body. What really struck me was how it was watching us. Not like an animal that's startled or aggressive, but with this awareness. It was studying us just as much as we were studying it. The creature was partially obscured by branches, but I could clearly see its outline and the way it shifted its weight from one foot to the other. We sat there in the truck, completely silent, for what must have been about 20 seconds. It felt much longer. Neither of us reached for a camera. This was before smartphones were everywhere, and honestly, we were too stunned to think about documenting the moment. Then, without any sudden movements, the creature simply turned and walked deeper into the trees. It moved with this smooth, natural gait, not lumbering like a bear or stiff like someone in a costume would move. It just walked away, occasionally glancing back in our direction. Mel and I looked at each other, both with this, "Did you just see that?" expression. Without saying a word, we got out of the truck. Looking back, that probably wasn't the smartest move, but curiosity got the better of us. We walked to where the creature had been standing and looked for tracks. The ground was covered with pine needles and forest debris, so we couldn't find any clear footprints, just some indistinct marks where something heavy had compressed the ground. Mel ventured a little bit into the trees, but I stayed near the road. After a few minutes, we both realized we didn't have any weapons with us, not even a decent knife, so we decided to head back to the truck. "What the hell was that, Ed?" Mel finally asked as we drove away. I didn't have an answer. It wasn't a bear. The movement and body shape were all wrong. It wasn't a person in a suit who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in a costume, and the way it moved was too natural, too fluid. Later that evening, Mel called his friend Bo, who was Karuk, one of the indigenous tribes from that area. When Mel described what we'd seen, Bo wasn't surprised at all. He told us there had been numerous sightings in that area for generations. The local tribes had names for these creatures and considered them to be another people who shared the forest with them. I went from being skeptical about Bigfoot to being pretty convinced we'd seen a young one that day. It wasn't some massive 8-foot monster like you see in the famous Patterson film. This was smaller, maybe a juvenile, but definitely not a known animal, and definitely not human. The second encounter happened about 6 years later, in September of 2006. I was camping with 4 friends in the Marble Mountain Wilderness, which is northeast of where the first sighting occurred. We'd set up camp near a small stream that fed into the Klamath River. One of our group, James, had gone fishing alone about a quarter-mile upstream from our camp. He came back looking uneasy, saying he'd heard something large moving in the trees while he was fishing. He couldn't see what it was, but said it sounded like it was pacing back and forth, breaking branches. We decided to split up into pairs to look around, partly out of curiosity and partly to make sure there wasn't a bear or mountain lion hanging around near our camp. My buddy Barry and I headed upstream along the path James had taken earlier. The sun was starting to set, and the forest was getting that golden hour glow that makes everything look a bit magical. We'd walked maybe 10 minutes when we heard this sound. I still have trouble describing it. It was like a shriek or a whistle, but not quite either. It was loud enough to make both of us stop in our tracks. About 200 feet ahead of us, we saw brush moving. Something was pushing through the undergrowth alongside the stream. Whatever it was big enough to make substantial branches sway. Then it stopped, and that's when I saw it. I could only see the head, shoulders, and part of its stomach through a gap in the vegetation. But what I saw will stay with me forever. It had this massive head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with no visible neck. The face was hard to describe. Flat, with a pronounced brow ridge. I couldn't make out detailed features from that distance, but the outline was unmistakably not human. Yet not any animal I recognized either. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its body was covered in the same type of uniform, dark hair I'd seen on the creature in 2000. This one was bigger though, taller and more muscular looking. It was staring right at us. The whole sighting lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then it moved, fast, much faster than something that size should be able to move. It pushed through more brush and disappeared. We heard crashing sounds for another few seconds, then nothing. Barry, who had been a skeptic about all things Bigfoot related, was visibly shaken. "I can't believe I just saw Bigfoot. I can't believe I just saw Bigfoot," he kept repeating as we hurried back to camp. When we told the others, reactions were mixed. Two of our friends thought we might have seen a bear, but Barry and I knew better. James believed us because of what he'd heard earlier. Our other friend, Al, then shared that he'd spent a lot of time fishing and hunting around Bluff Creek, which is famous for Bigfoot sightings, and had often heard strange grunts, screams, and what sounded like conversations between unknown creatures, though he'd never actually seen one. We spent that night huddled closer to our campfire than we normally would have. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made us all jump. We didn't feel threatened exactly. Whatever I saw didn't seem aggressive. But there's something deeply unsettling about knowing you're sharing the woods with something that shouldn't exist, according to conventional wisdom. The next morning, we went back to the spot where we'd had the sighting. The ground was hard and rocky there, so again, no footprints. We found a few broken branches and disturbed vegetation, but nothing conclusive enough to prove what we'd seen. Since those two encounters, I've spent a lot more time in the woods of Northern California. I've never had another clear sighting, but I've had plenty of strange experiences, feeling watched, hearing odd vocalizations, finding structures of sticks that don't appear natural. I've become convinced these creatures are out there. They're rare, they're incredibly adapted to their environment, and they're smart enough to avoid humans most of the time. But they're there. My advice to anyone spending time in these areas: stop occasionally, be quiet, and really look around. Don't just hurry from point A to point B with your eyes on the trail. These beings are there to be seen if you're observant enough and lucky enough, or unlucky enough, depending on how you view such encounters. I still don't know exactly what I saw those 2 times. I can't definitively say it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch, or whatever name you want to use. But I know what it wasn't. It wasn't any recognized animal, and it certainly wasn't human. And I know I'm not alone in having seen these things in those woods. I don't talk about these experiences much in everyday life. People look at you differently when you say you've seen Bigfoot, but I know what I saw, and no one can convince me otherwise. Story 9. I've never really told this story to many people. Most folks just think I'm making it up or remembering things wrong because I was just a kid. But I know what I saw that day in Caseville, and it stayed with me for all these years. It was July 15th, 1965. I remember the date clearly because it was my cousin's birthday, and that's why we were having this big beach weenie roast at Caseville in Huron County. I was 12 years old, and back then, summers meant freedom. No worries, except getting home before the streetlights came on. The day had been perfect, that kind of summer day that feels endless when you're a kid. The adults had set up a big bonfire on the beach, and there were probably 20 people there between my family and a couple others who were friends of my parents. The sun was starting to go down, casting this orange glow over everything. We kids had spent the whole day swimming and building sandcastles, and now we were roasting hot dogs and marshmallows. My little sister Betsy was 5, and she kept getting marshmallow all over her face. Mom was trying to keep her clean, but it was a losing battle. Dad was talking with Uncle Frank about fishing or something. It was just normal, safe. That changed when Tommy Miller and his friend Jake came running up to our campfire. They were maybe 10 years old, and they looked absolutely terrified. Tommy was crying, and Jake kept looking back over his shoulder like something was chasing them. "A witch attacked us," Tommy was yelling. He had sand all over him and a scrape on his knee. All the older kids started laughing. "There's no such thing as witches," my cousin David said, rolling his eyes. But I could tell Tommy wasn't making it up. His hands were shaking, and he had this look in his eyes I'd never seen before. Real fear. "We were playing in the sand dunes," Jake explained, his voice cracking. "We found this place that looked like a trap or something, all dug out. When we got close, this thing jumped out at us." The adults tried to calm them down. My dad suggested it was probably just an older kid playing a prank, or maybe they'd startled a deer or something. but Tommy kept insisting. It wasn't a person, it was hairy and it growled at us. That's when us older kids got curious. My cousin David, who was 14 and thought he was so grown up, suggested we go check it out ourselves. The adults were distracted with cooking and talking, so about 8 of us decided to sneak off and investigate. Mum told us not to go too far, but we just promised we'd stay where they could see us. David suggested we split up into pairs to cover more ground. I got paired with Lisa Johnson, who lived down the street from us back home. She was 13 and usually acted like she was too cool to hang out with me, but she seemed excited about this adventure. The sand dunes were massive to a 12-year-old. They rose up behind the beach like small mountains, covered in patches of tall beach grass that rustled in the wind. The sun was getting lower, and the shadows in the dunes were growing longer. Lisa and I took the path that led up between 2 large dunes. The sand made it hard to walk, our feet sinking with each step. We had to grab onto the beach grass sometimes to pull ourselves up the steeper parts. "This is stupid," Lisa kept saying, but she didn't turn back. We'd been climbing for maybe 10 minutes when we reached a flatter area between dunes. There was a depression in the sand, like someone had been digging. This must have been the trap Tommy mentioned. "Hello?" I called out, not too loud. "Anyone here?" That's when I heard it, this low rumbling growl that didn't sound like any animal I knew. It wasn't like a dog or a bear, it was deeper, more purposeful somehow. I looked up toward where the sound came from, and that's when I saw it. About 8 feet in front of us, standing at the edge of a cluster of beach grass, was something. I say something because my brain couldn't process it as any animal I recognized. Lisa saw it at the exact same moment I did. She didn't scream, she didn't say anything, she just turned and ran, sliding and stumbling down the sandy path we'd come up. I was frozen in place. The creature was shorter than I expected, maybe about 4 feet tall. But it had these massive shoulders like a football player. It was hunched forward with almost no neck visible, just this small round head sitting on those enormous shoulders. Its chest looked smooth, almost like leather, and I could see the outlines of muscles underneath. Its arms were what really struck me. They were way too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees. The hands at the end of those arms were huge, with what looked like 1-inch claws extending from the fingers. The whole thing was covered in this orangish hair, not quite red, but not brown either. Where the hair was thinner, I could see veins and tendons moving underneath. I stood there, unable to move, just staring at it. It stared back at me with these eyes that I can't really describe. They weren't animal eyes. There was something in them that seemed intelligent. Curious, maybe. Then it took a step toward me. That broke the spell. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The sand made it hard, and I kept slipping and sliding down the path. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I was sure that any second I'd feel those claws grabbing me from behind. I didn't look back until I reached the bottom of the dune. When I did, I couldn't see anything following me. When I got back to the campfire, I was crying and out of breath. Lisa was already there, but she wasn't saying anything about what we'd seen. She was just sitting close to her mum, looking pale. "Samantha, what's wrong?" my mum asked, rushing over to me. I tried to explain, but the words came out all jumbled. "There's something in the dunes, a monster or something." The adults exchanged those looks that grown-ups give each other when they think a kid is being dramatic. "Honey, you probably just saw a deer or maybe even a bear. They sometimes come down to the shore," my dad said, patting my shoulder. "It wasn't a deer or a bear. It had orange hair and long arms," I insisted. Tommy piped up, "That's what we saw. That's the witch." The other kids who had gone exploring came back one by one. None of them had seen anything unusual, and David started teasing me and Tommy about having overactive imaginations. I was about to argue more when I realized something that made my blood run cold. "Where's Betsy?" I asked, suddenly not seeing my little sister anywhere around the fire. Mom looked around, alarmed. I thought she was with your father. Dad stood up. I thought she was with you. Everyone started calling Betsy's name. The adults spread out along the beach looking for her. I felt sick with worry, thinking about that creature and my tiny 5-year-old sister. After about 5 minutes, that felt like 5 hours, we heard Betsy's voice. "I'm here!" She came walking calmly out from between the dunes, a little ways down from where Lisa and I had gone up. She wasn't crying or scared. She was just walking normally, like she'd gone for a little stroll. Mom ran to her and hugged her tight. "Betsy, what were you doing? You know you're not supposed to wander off." Betsy looked confused by all the fuss. "I was just looking at the big Frankenstein wolfman." Everyone got quiet. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Dad asked, kneeling down to her level. "The big hairy man. He was nice. I could have touched his ankle, but I didn't," she said matter-of-factly. My heart was racing again. "Where did you see him, Betsy?" She pointed toward the dunes. "He was walking there. He looked confused." The adults tried to get more information from her, but in typical 5-year-old fashion, she quickly lost interest in the conversation and started asking for more marshmallows. Mom and Dad decided it was time to pack up and head home. They blamed it on the hour getting late. But I could tell they were unsettled by what Betsy had said. As we were gathering our things, I overheard Dad talking to Uncle Frank. "Kids and their imaginations," Dad said, but his voice sounded strained. "Yeah," Uncle Frank replied, "but it's weird they all described the same thing. Probably just Tommy scared the others with his story, and they thought they saw something," Dad reasoned. But I knew what I saw, and apparently, so did Betsy. On the car ride home, Betsy fell asleep quickly, but I stayed awake, replaying the encounter in my mind. One detail kept bothering me. Betsy had said she could have touched its ankle, which meant she was very close to it. But it hadn't hurt her. In fact, she described it as nice and confused. I wondered if maybe it was as scared of us as we were of it. When we got home, I tried to talk to my parents again about what I'd seen, but they just told me I had an active imagination and to stop scaring my sister with monster stories. The next day, I called Lisa to talk about it, but she pretended not to know what I was talking about. "We didn't see anything, Sam. Just stop it," she said before hanging up. Over the years, I've read books about Bigfoot sightings, and some descriptions match what I saw that day, but others don't. Most accounts describe Bigfoot as being much taller, more human-like in proportion. What I saw was shorter, with those strange proportions and orange hair. I've never gone back to those sand dunes at Caseville. My family went to different beaches after that summer, though my parents never said it was because of what happened. Sometimes I wonder if Betsy remembers it. We've never really talked about it as adults. Maybe she thinks it was just a childhood fantasy now. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. That creature, whatever it was, existed. And the most chilling part is that it seemed interested in us. Not aggressive, not predatory, just curious. I'm 58 years old now, and I still sometimes wake up from dreams of orange hair and long arms reaching for me. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run away. Would it have approached me the way it approached Betsy? Would it have tried to communicate somehow? I'll never know, but I'll also never forget those intelligent eyes staring back at me from that small, round head. Eyes that didn't belong to any animal I've ever known. Story 10. I've been hesitant to share this for years, mainly because I don't want to come off as some nut job. But after watching a few documentaries recently, I can't keep this to myself anymore. What happened to me and my crew back in '96 still gives me chills, and I'm hoping writing this out might help me process it. I was working as a trail crew leader for the Forest Service in Northern California. That summer, we were assigned to clear and maintain a remote wilderness trail in the Trinity Alps. My crew consisted of 12 workers, mostly college kids looking for summer work. a couple of seasoned trail dogs, and myself. We were deep in the Trinity Forest wilderness, about 26 miles from anything resembling civilization. Our base camp was set up in this gorgeous meadow near Red Cap Lake, about 5 miles off the main access road. The spot was picture perfect, wildflowers everywhere, crystal clear water, and these massive pine and fir trees surrounding us like silent guardians. During the day, you couldn't ask for a more beautiful workplace. The trail we were clearing started at around 5,000 feet elevation and wound through some pretty interesting terrain. What made this assignment unique was that our path took us through what I later learned were ancient prayer rocks of the Hooper and Yurok tribes. At the time, I just thought they were interesting rock formations. I had no idea of their significance. Most days followed the same routine. We'd wake at dawn, eat breakfast, pack our lunches and head out with our tools. Pulaskis, McLeods, crosscut saws, the works. We'd clear fallen trees, fix erosion damage and maintain the trail until late afternoon, then head back to camp for dinner. By nightfall, we'd be in our tents, exhausted. This particular day in mid-July had been brutal. The temperature hit the high 90s, which is scorching when you're doing physical labor at elevation. We'd been clearing a section of trail that had multiple blowdowns, trees that had fallen across the path during winter storms. Cross-cutting those monsters by hand is back-breaking work. We got back to camp later than usual, around 7 in the evening. Everyone was beat. After a quick dinner of pasta and canned sauce, most of the crew retired to their tents. A few of us sat around the small campfire we'd built, just unwinding and sharing stories. The mosquitoes weren't too bad that night, which was a rare blessing. It must have been around 10:30 when the first strange thing happened. The night had grown unusually quiet. If you've spent time in forests, you know they're never truly silent. There's always some ambient noise from insects, frogs, owls, or the wind in the trees, but suddenly everything just stopped. No crickets, no rustling, nothing. Just this heavy, pressing silence. "You guys notice that?" asked Jake, one of the more experienced crew members. We all nodded. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt this weird pressure in my ears, like right before a thunderstorm. But the sky was clear. I remember looking up and seeing more stars than you could possibly count. The silence lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Then, from somewhere up on the ridge above our camp, we heard it. A scream that still haunts my dreams. I've spent most of my adult life in the wilderness. I've heard mountain lions, bears, coyotes, elk, and just about every critter that makes noise in the California mountains. This wasn't any of those. It started as this low, guttural growl that built into a scream so loud it seemed to physically press against us. It was both human-like and completely alien at the same time, like someone had combined a woman's scream with a bear's roar and amplified it tenfold. The sound echoed across the meadow, bouncing off the mountains around us. By this point, everyone was awake, poking heads out of tents or standing frozen by the fire. I remember Michelle, one of the college kids, was shaking so bad she dropped her mug of tea. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard a massive cracking sound from the ridge above our camp. It was the unmistakable sound of wood splintering, like when a tree falls during a windstorm, but there was no wind that night, not even a breeze. Then came the rumbling. I swung my flashlight toward the sound just in time to see something that defies explanation. A full-grown fir tree, I'd estimate at least 60 feet tall, was tumbling down the rocky cliff face above our camp. It wasn't falling naturally like a dead tree would. It looked like it had been pushed, deliberately shoved off the cliff. The tree crashed and bounced down the rocky slope, gathering speed. We all scattered, grabbing whatever gear was nearest and running. The tree slammed into the ground at the edge of our camp, missing the nearest tent by maybe 15 feet. The impact shook the ground under our feet. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. We all just stared at this massive tree that had nearly crushed us. Then someone, I think it was Rick, started frantically packing his gear. "I'm out. "I'm walking back to the truck tonight," he said, his voice cracking. I managed to calm everyone down, though honestly, I was just as terrified. We decided to move our tents farther from the ridge and double up so nobody would be alone. We built the fire up as big as safety would allow and took shifts staying awake through the night. Nobody slept much anyway. Throughout the night, we heard that scream 2 more times, but more distant, like whatever made it was moving away. I kept my Pulaski by my side the whole time, though what good it would have done against something strong enough to push over a mature tree, I don't know. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When it did, we immediately investigated the fallen tree. It was a healthy Douglas fir, probably 50 to 60 years old. The base, where it had broken, showed fresh green wood, not the dry, rotted core you'd see in a tree that fell naturally. This thing had been alive and firmly rooted before something snapped it off at the base. What's more disturbing is what we found at the top of the ridge. A few of us climbed up there while the others packed camp. The ground around where the tree had stood was disturbed, not by equipment or anything mechanical. There were depressions in the soil that looked vaguely like footprints, but much larger than any human foot and not shaped quite like a bear's paw either. They were approximately 16 inches long and incredibly deep, as if whatever left them was extremely heavy. We were scheduled to be joined by a local guide that day, a member of the Hooper tribe who worked with the Forest Service as a cultural liaison. When he arrived around 9 that morning, I immediately told him what happened. I expected skepticism or maybe a rational explanation. Instead, his face grew serious. He walked over to examine the fallen tree, then up to the ridge to see the disturbed ground. When he came back down, he gathered us all together. "You're working on sacred ground," he explained. "These prayer rocks have been used by my people for thousands of years. This area is protected." "Protected by what?" Michelle asked, still visibly shaken. "By what you might call Bigfoot. We have another name for them," he said. When he saw our expressions, he didn't laugh or backtrack. "That sound you described, I've heard it before. My grandfather heard it. It's a warning. Under normal circumstances, I might have dismissed this as local folklore. But after what we'd witnessed, none of us were in a position to be skeptical. The guide advised us to leave tobacco as an offering and to speak our intentions aloud before continuing our work, explaining that we meant no harm and were only maintaining the trail. We debated whether to continue the project at all. 2 crew members opted to leave, and I arranged for them to get a ride out with a supply truck. The rest of us decided to stay, but moved our camp a mile downstream to what the guide suggested was a less sensitive area. That day, our work was tense and quiet. Every snapping twig made us jump. I found myself constantly scanning the ridgelines above us. We finished early and headed back to our new campsite before dusk. That night passed without incident, as did the rest of our 3-week assignment. But something had changed. The forest felt different, like we were being watched. Not necessarily with malice, but with awareness. I can't explain it better than that. Years passed, and I eventually moved on from the Forest Service to other work. I rarely talked about what happened that night. When I did, I usually downplayed it, suggesting it was probably just a coincidence. A dead tree falling at the same time as some animal, maybe a mountain lion, screamed. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever pushed that tree had done so with purpose and strength no known animal possesses. The timing wasn't coincidental. Then, about 2 years ago, I was watching this documentary about Bigfoot encounters. They played audio recordings of purported Bigfoot vocalizations gathered from various wilderness areas across the country. When I heard the sound, my blood ran cold. It was identical to what we'd heard that night in the Trinity Alps. That same haunting scream that started as a growl and built to an almost unbearable pitch. I still don't know what to make of what happened. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or cryptids, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and what I felt that night. Something intelligent and powerful enough to snap a healthy tree and push it down a cliff was sending us a message, and for whatever reason, it chose to warn us rather than harm us, though it easily could have. So that's my story. Take from it what you will. All I know is that there are places in our wilderness that deserve respect, and perhaps there are still things out there we don't understand. 26 years later, I still get chills thinking about that scream echoing across Red Cap Meadow, and sometimes in my dreams I still see that tree tumbling down the cliff toward our tents. Story 11. I don't usually share this stuff online, but after reading other people's experiences, I figured maybe someone here might know what the hell happened to me and my dad that day in East Texas. This happened about 6 years ago when I was bow hunting with my dad in Rusk County. We'd just gotten access to this new lease property that bordered the Angelina River, and it was late September, so we were doing some pre-season scouting before the October opener. Dad had been hunting these East Texas woods his whole life, and I'd been tagging along since I was old enough to walk quietly. That day started like any normal scouting trip. We got to the property around 3 in the afternoon, when the September heat was starting to back off a bit. It was still humid as hell, though. You know how those river bottoms get, where your clothes stick to you the minute you step out of the air conditioning. We had our day packs with water and some basic gear, and I brought my rangefinder to mark some potential stand locations. The lease was about 200 acres, but the part we were most interested in was this stretch along the river bottom. It was thick with oak trees dropping acorns and had these natural funnels where deer would have to pass through to get from bedding to feeding areas. Perfect bow hunting territory, if you've ever seen it. We parked the truck at this old logging road entrance and headed in on foot. The plan was simple: walk the property line along the river, look for deer sign, and get out before dark. Nothing we hadn't done 100 times before. For the first couple hours, everything was normal. We found some decent deer trails, a few rubs from last season, and plenty of tracks in the muddy areas near the water. Dad was marking waypoints on his GPS, and I was taking mental notes of which trees might make good stand locations. It was around 6 in the evening when things started feeling different. The woods had been alive with the usual sounds: squirrels chattering, birds calling, the occasional splash from the river, but then it just sort of stopped. At first I didn't consciously notice it. It was more like this gradual awareness that crept up on me. I remember checking my watch and thinking we should start heading back soon, since we had about an hour of daylight left. That's when I first felt it, this sensation of being watched. I've spent my whole life in the woods, and you develop this sixth sense after a while. Any hunter knows what I'm talking about. It's this prickly feeling on the back of your neck that tells you something isn't right. I glanced over at Dad, who was kneeling down examining some deer droppings, trying to gauge how fresh they were. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual, so I tried to shake it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. "Dad," I said quietly, "you feel that?" He looked up at me, then slowly scanned the woods around us. "Feel what?" "I don't know. Just feels weird all of a sudden." He stood up, and I could tell he was listening more intently now. "Woods got quiet," he said after a moment. That's when I realized what was bothering me. There were no bird calls, no squirrels, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves from the light breeze. In the woods, sudden silence usually means one thing: something has spooked the wildlife. "Probably just a coyote moving through," Dad said, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Let's keep going a bit further. I want to check out that bend in the river before we head back." We continued walking, but now we were both on high alert. The river bottom was getting thicker, with more underbrush and these gnarly cypress knees sticking up from the damp ground. The light was starting to fade, filtering through the canopy in this eerie, golden-green glow that made shadows stretch longer than they should have. We'd gone maybe another quarter-mile when Dad stopped and pointed to this huge oak tree that had fallen across a game trail. "That'd be a good spot," he said. "Deer'll have to go around it either way." I was about to answer when we heard it. The first scream hit me like a physical blow. It came from across the bottomland, maybe 100 yards away on the other side of this small slough. It's hard to describe accurately, but imagine a woman screaming at the top of her lungs, that high-pitched sound that cuts right through you. But underneath it was this other quality, this deeper, almost growling tone that no human could make. It lasted for maybe 5 seconds, and I swear to God it seemed directed right at us. I froze. Dad froze. We both just stood there, staring in the direction it had come from, but the vegetation was too thick to see anything. "What the fuck was that?" I whispered, my hand automatically reaching for the hunting knife on my belt. Though what good that would have done, I don't know. Dad didn't answer. He just held up his hand for me to be quiet, his eyes never leaving the spot where the sound had originated. About 30 seconds later, it happened again, the same scream. But this time it sounded closer, maybe 75 yards away. It had this weird quality to it, almost like it was asking a question or demanding a response. Again, it lasted several seconds, rising in pitch before cutting off abruptly. Here's what scared me more than the actual sound. My dad's reaction. I've been hunting with him my whole life. I've seen him face down angry landowners, navigate in pitch darkness when our headlamps died, even stand his ground when we accidentally got between a sow and her cubs one time in Arkansas. The man doesn't scare easily. But right then, his face went completely blank, and I saw his hand tighten around his walking stick until his knuckles were white. We still couldn't see anything through the trees and brush. The light was fading fast now, and the shadows between the trees had deepened to this murky grey-black that could hide anything. Then the third scream came. This one was different, longer, more sustained, and it changed partway through, starting as that same woman-like scream but ending in what I can only describe as a roar, like something letting us know it was pissed off. And it was closer, maybe 50 yards away now. Dad grabbed my arm. He didn't say a word, just gave me this look and tilted his head back toward the way we'd come. We needed to leave. Now, we turned and started walking quickly back the way we came. Not running. You never run in the woods unless what's behind you is worse than what you might run into. But moving with purpose. Every few steps, I'd look back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing visible in the gathering darkness. The woods were still dead silent, except for the sound of our boots on the leaf litter and our slightly quickened breathing. I kept thinking about how far we were from the truck, probably 1.5 miles at this point, and how the light was failing fast. "Dad, what was that?" I asked after we'd put a couple 100 yards between us and where we'd heard the screams. "Don't know," he said tersely, which was unusual for him. Dad always has an explanation for weird wood stuff. "Always. Keep moving." We picked up the pace a little more, and I noticed Dad kept looking back too. The bottomland forest seemed to close in around us, branches reaching out like fingers in the dim light. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. Every snap of a twig under our feet sounded like a gunshot in the silence. About halfway back to the truck, Dad suddenly stopped and held up his hand again. I froze mid-step, straining to hear what had caught his attention. For a few seconds there was nothing, and then I heard it. A sound like something heavy moving through the underbrush parallel to us, maybe 50 yards to our right. Not directly toward us, but definitely keeping pace. We stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. The sound stopped. Then there was this loud crack, like a sizable branch breaking, followed by silence again. Dad motioned for us to keep moving, and we did, faster now. The forest had gotten so dark that we had to watch our footing carefully to avoid tripping over roots or cypress knees. The only blessing was that we were following the same route back, so we knew there weren't any major obstacles in our way. As we got closer to the truck, I started to relax a little. thinking maybe we'd put enough distance between us and whatever had made those sounds. That's when we heard it again, that same scream. But now it was back in the direction we'd originally heard it, much farther away, like it was letting us know it was still there. But it wasn't following us anymore. When we finally reached the truck, I've never been so happy to see a beat-up Ford F-150 in my life. We tossed our packs in the bed and got in without saying a word. Dad started the engine, turned the truck around on the narrow logging road, and we headed out. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that either of us spoke. "What do you think that was?" I asked again. Dad was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Don't know," he finally said. "Been hunting these woods for 40 years and never heard anything like that." "Could it have been a cougar?" I suggested, though I knew mountain lions don't usually scream like that. "Wasn't a cat," he said with certainty. "Wasn't a person either." And that was pretty much all he'd say about it. We drove the rest of the way home, mostly in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. The weird thing is, we kept hunting that lease. We went back plenty of times that season and the next. We even set up stands not far from where we'd heard those screams, but we never heard anything like that again. Sometimes when I was sitting alone in my stand at dawn or dusk, I'd find myself listening more intently than usual, half expecting to hear that sound again, but it never came back. Dad and I never really talked about it much after that day. It was like this unspoken agreement between us to just file it away as one of those unexplainable things that happens sometimes, but I know he remembers it as clearly as I do. Sometimes when we're in the woods together, I'll catch him stopping to listen a little longer than necessary when the birds suddenly go quiet. I've been hunting all my life. I've heard coyotes, owls, bobcats, wild pigs, and every other critter that lives in those East Texas bottoms. I know what they all sound like. What we heard that September evening wasn't any of those things. It wasn't human, but it seemed intelligent, like it knew exactly what it was doing, warning us that we were in its territory. To this day, I still can't explain what we encountered in those woods along the Angelina River. All I know is that there are some sounds you hear once and never forget. Sounds that remind you that for all our guns and gear and supposed mastery over nature, the woods still hold mysteries we can't explain. Story 12. I've been hesitating to share this for a long time. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or the supernatural. I'm just a regular mom living in Sussex County, New Jersey, on a property that's been in my family for generations. What happened to me on August 12th, 2010 changed everything I thought I knew about our woods. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake a bit. That morning started like any other. I woke up around 6:30, made coffee, and waited for the kids to get up. It was summer vacation, so they were sleeping in. Around 7, I decided to walk down our long gravel driveway to get the newspaper. It's about a quarter mile from the house to the main road, and I've made that walk thousands of times. The air was still cool, with that heavy August humidity just starting to build. Everything was completely normal. I reached the end of the driveway, grabbed the paper from the box, and started heading back. I remember stopping about halfway up the driveway to put my hair up in a ponytail because I was getting sweaty. Our property is about 50 acres, mostly wooded, with our house sitting in a cleared area. The tree line runs along both sides of the driveway. That's when it happened. I looked up after fixing my hair, and I froze. There was something standing at the edge of the trees about 60 feet away. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear? A neighbor in a weird coat? But it wasn't either of those things. This creature was tall, I'd guess around 7 feet, with this tan-brown fur that looked kind of matted or clumped in spots. What struck me most was its build. The shoulders and torso were incredibly wide, almost disproportionate to the rest of its body. It wasn't standing completely upright like a person would. There was this slight hunch, especially in the upper back, that gave it this curved spine appearance. I couldn't see its face clearly because it was partially turned away from me for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Neither of us moved. I didn't even breathe. Then it just turned and disappeared into the woods. It didn't crash through the underbrush or make any noise. It just seemed to melt back into the trees, silently. My body finally unfroze, and I ran the rest of the way to the house, dropped the newspaper on the porch and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept telling myself it was a bear, even though I knew it wasn't. Bears don't stand like that. Bears don't have that body shape. Bears don't move silently through dense underbrush. I didn't tell my kids what happened. What would I even say? Mum saw a monster in the woods. They were 11 and 14 at the time, old enough to get scared, but young enough to either not believe me or become terrified of our property. So I kept quiet and tried to convince myself I'd seen something normal. But then the knocking started. It was that same afternoon. The kids were playing video games, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the direction of the woods. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat, a hollow, wooden sound. At first, I thought maybe it was a woodpecker, but the rhythm was too regular, too deliberate, and it was loud, much louder than any woodpecker I'd ever heard. The knocks stopped for a few minutes, then started again. This time it was 5 knocks, with the same even spacing between each one. It sounded farther away this time, like whatever was making the noise had moved deeper into the forest. I went outside onto the deck and stood there listening. The knocking had stopped, but something else hit me immediately. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no squirrels chattering, nothing. In August, our woods are usually buzzing with life and noise, but that afternoon, it was dead quiet. The hair on my arm stood up and I went back inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check the locks and peek out the windows. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the knocking again. This time it seemed to be coming from near our pond, which is about half a mile into the woods. It started faint and distant, then gradually got louder, like whatever was making the sound was moving closer to the house. I sat in my bedroom window with all the lights off, just listening as it got closer and closer. Then it stopped, maybe 100 yards from the house. The silence that followed was almost worse than the knocking. The next evening I was watching TV with the kids when I glanced out the sliding glass door that leads to our back deck. There it was again. That same figure, standing just beyond our yard at the edge of the trees. It was partially hidden behind a large oak, but I could make out that same broad shoulder and the tan-brown fur. My blood went cold. I must have made some kind of noise because my son asked what was wrong. When I looked back at him and then back to the window, the figure was gone. The knocking continued over the next few days, always following the same pattern, starting far away, then moving closer to the house. Sometimes it would happen during the day, sometimes in the middle of the night. I started noticing other things too. The deer that used to come into our yard every evening stopped showing up. The squirrels and rabbits that were constantly darting around disappeared. Even the chorus of frogs and insects at night seemed muted, like they were afraid to make too much noise. About a week after my first sighting, I was up late reading when I heard something on the deck. Not knocking this time, it sounded like footsteps, heavy footsteps. I got up and approached the sliding door, but I didn't turn on any lights. Through the glass, I could see a dark shape moving on the deck. It was too dark to make out details, but I could tell it was big, really big. I stood there paralyzed, watching this shape move back and forth in front of the door. Then it stopped, right in front of where I was standing. I don't know if it could see me through the glass in the darkness, but it felt like it was looking right at me. After what seemed like forever, it moved away and disappeared back into the darkness of the yard. The next morning, I found footprints on the deck. They were huge, easily twice the size of my foot, and had this weird shape that wasn't quite human but wasn't animal either. They were pressed deep into the wood, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I started researching online, trying to figure out what could explain what I was seeing and hearing. That's when I stumbled across information about Sasquatch and realized what I was experiencing matched many of the reports. The knocking, the silence in the woods, the footprints, it all fit. But even then I was skeptical. Bigfoot isn't supposed to be real. These things don't exist outside of movies and campfire stories. Except something was on my property. Something was watching my house. Something was scaring away all the wildlife. One night in late August, the knocking was particularly intense. It started around 11 p.m. way back by the pond, then slowly made its way toward the house, getting louder and more insistent. By midnight, it sounded like it was right at the edge of our yard. My kids were asleep, but I was wide awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights off, listening. Then the knocking stopped, and I heard heavy footsteps circling the house. They would pause occasionally, like whatever was out there was stopping to look in the windows. I was too terrified to get up and look. The footsteps circled the entire house twice, then moved back toward the deck. I heard the wood creak under its weight. Then something tapped on the sliding glass door. Not the hard knocking from before, but a softer, almost gentle tapping, like it was trying to get my attention. 3 soft taps, a pause, then 3 more. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and walked slowly to the door. Through the glass, I could make out a massive silhouette. It was so tall that its head nearly reached the top of the door frame. We stood there, separated by nothing but a sheet of glass, just looking at each other. I couldn't see its face clearly in the darkness, but I could feel it watching me. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Then it raised one enormous hand and placed it flat against the glass. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself raising my hand and placing it against the glass opposite its hand. My hand looked tiny compared to its massive palm. We stayed like that for maybe 5 seconds. Then it pulled its hand away, turned, and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning there was a perfect handprint on the outside of the glass. Each finger was huge, with what looked like a leathery texture to the skin. I cleaned it off before the kids could see it. After that night, the activity changed. The knocking became less frequent, and it stayed farther away from the house. I'd still occasionally see a dark shape moving among the trees at dusk, but it never came close to the house again. It was like we'd reached some kind of understanding. I haven't had another clear sighting since that August, but I know it's still out there. Sometimes when I'm alone on the property, I feel like I'm being watched. The wildlife patterns have never returned to normal. The deer are still scarce, and the smaller animals stay away from certain parts of our woods. There's a heaviness in the air sometimes, especially near the pond, like the space itself is being occupied by something massive. The knocking still happens occasionally, usually when it's been a while since I've heard anything. It's almost like it's reminding me that it's still here, still watching. I've never told anyone about this. Not my friends, not my family, not even my kids. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself, and I'm the one who experienced it. But I know what I saw that day in August. I know what's been living in my woods for the past 12 years. There's a Sasquatch on my property, and somehow we've learned to coexist. I don't know why it chose to stay here or what it wants. All I know is that my understanding of what's possible, of what exists in this world, changed forever that morning, when I looked up from fixing my hair and saw something that shouldn't exist staring back at me from the edge of the trees. Even now, when I walk down that driveway, I can't help but glance toward that same spot, wondering if today will be the day I see it clearly again. Story 13. I'm not sure if I should even be posting this. For 16 years, I've kept this bottled up, only telling my sister and a couple close friends. but it's getting to the point where I need to put it somewhere. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it. This happened back in July of 2006. My husband Michael and I had been living in our house near Hamilton, New Jersey for about 3 years. It was a nice little 2-story place with a detached garage backing up to a pretty dense stretch of woods. We loved it because it felt private, but wasn't totally isolated. Our nearest neighbors were about a quarter mile down the road. I'd always been the nature lover between us. I'd set up bird feeders, planted flowers to attract butterflies, and even put out corn occasionally for the deer. We had this gorgeous buck that would visit, had this unique rack with a little fork on the right side that made him instantly recognizable. I called him Ferdinand. Silly, I know. I'd see him almost every evening in the spring and early summer. Our dog, Baxter, a spaniel mix we'd rescued, was getting older and had arthritis. So we'd started letting him sleep in the garage where it was cooler in the summer. He had a nice bed set up, and the garage was right below our bedroom window. I should mention that for a few months before this happened, I'd been feeling uncomfortable when I'd sit out on our back patio in the evenings. Nothing I could put my finger on, just this creeping sensation of being watched. Michael would laugh it off when I mentioned it. "It's probably just Ferdinand keeping an eye on you," he'd say. But Ferdinand had stopped coming around sometime in June. I hadn't seen him for weeks, which was unusual. There had been other little things too. Twice in the week before the incident, I'd heard tapping sounds on the side of the house at night, not like branches, more deliberate. Tap, 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 then silence. Tap, tap, tap. Michael slept through it both times, and when I mentioned it the next morning, he suggested it might be a woodpecker, even though it was the middle of the night. Also, a big oak tree behind our garage had some damage that appeared suddenly. Strips of bark torn off about 8 feet up the trunk, and several thick branches snapped off higher up, maybe 12 or 13 feet. Michael thought maybe it had been storm damage, but we hadn't had any significant storms. So anyway, it was July 23rd, a hot, sticky night. We had the AC running, but I still had the window cracked open a bit because I like fresh air when I sleep. Michael was out cold beside me. That man could sleep through the apocalypse. I remember glancing at the alarm clock when I first woke up. 3:45 in the morning. What woke me was a sound I can't fully describe even now. It started as this low, drawn-out moan, almost like an injured animal. My first thought was that maybe Baxter was sick or hurt, but then the sound changed. It got deeper, more guttural, and there was this quality to it that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was full of rage or frustration or something primally emotional that animals just don't express. It wasn't a bear. We don't have them around Hamilton much, and I know what bears sound like anyway. This was something else entirely. I tried to wake Michael, shaking his shoulder and whispering his name urgently, but he just grunted and rolled over. The sound came again, and this time I could tell it was coming from directly beneath our window, near the garage. Baxter started barking, 3 sharp, alarmed barks. He was normally pretty vocal about animals in the yard, so I expected him to keep going, but after those 3 barks, he went completely silent. Not gradually quiet, instantly silent in a way that made my stomach drop. That's when it happened. Whatever was out there let out this growl isn't even the right word. It was so deep and powerful that I felt it vibrating through the floor and up through the bed. It was like nothing I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not any animal I could identify. It sounded ancient and furious, and then there was a single powerful strike against the wall, not like someone knocking or an animal scratching. It was like something had slammed a fist or a limb directly into the wall just above the garage door, with incredible force. The whole house seemed to shudder. I remember thinking the siding might be damaged. That's how hard it hit. I sat frozen in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was terrified to move, terrified to look out the window, terrified that whatever was out there would see me if I did. I just sat there, clutching the blanket, listening. After that single strike, there was silence. Not normal nighttime silence with crickets and frogs and the occasional owl. This was absolute silence, like everything in the woods was holding its breath. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like hours, but it was probably more like 20 minutes. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat in bed, staring at the window, too afraid to look out, but also afraid to look away. When the sun finally came up, I shook Michael awake and told him what happened. He went outside to check things out, but found nothing except a dent in the siding exactly where I'd heard the impact. No footprints, nothing disturbed. Baxter seemed fine but unusually clingy that day, staying right at my heels. Over the next few days, I started connecting dots that I should have connected sooner. About 6 months earlier, we'd had house guests who mentioned hearing something moving around outside their window at night. We'd laughed it off, saying it was probably just deer. But now, I wasn't so sure. Ferdinand the buck never came back. The birds seemed fewer at the feeders. Even the raccoons that used to raid our trash occasionally stopped coming around. It was like the wildlife had just vacated the area. I started researching online, trying to find explanations for what I'd experienced. That's when I stumbled across accounts of Sasquatch encounters. I'd never given Bigfoot much thought before. It seemed like a silly tabloid thing. But as I read account after account, I felt a chill of recognition. The vocalizations, the wood knocking, the intimidation displays, the affected wildlife patterns, the feeling of being watched. I read about how they'll monitor a property for weeks or months before making themselves known. How they'll tap on houses at night, how they can reach heights that would be impossible for known wildlife, how they sometimes seem to have an interest in observing humans, how dogs often react to them with unusual fear. One detail that really got to me was from a report where someone described a Sasquatch tearing bark from trees and breaking branches at heights of 8 to 15 feet, exactly like the damage to our oak tree. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I've spent 16 years telling myself I'm being ridiculous, that there must be a rational explanation. But deep down, I know what I heard and felt, that night wasn't an ordinary animal. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or a person playing tricks. It was something else. We moved away from that house about 2 years after the incident for unrelated reasons. Michael still thinks I just had a vivid nightmare combined with some coincidental wildlife activity. Maybe he's right. I hope he's right. But I know what I experienced. To this day, I can't sleep with the window open. I can't stand the feeling of being watched from the woods. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night and hear an unusual sound outside, I feel that same paralyzing fear all over again. What bothers me most is not knowing why it came to our window that night. Was it just curious? Was it trying to scare us away? Was it angry about something? I'll never know. All I know is that something intelligent and powerful made its presence known to me that night, and 16 years later, I still can't shake the feeling that it's out there somewhere, watching and waiting. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I experienced, and no amount of rational explanation has ever been able to fully account for what happened that night in July of 2006. Story 14. I still don't know exactly what we encountered that August back in '96, but I'm convinced it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist. I've spent most of my life being the guy who disproves things. 27 years as an insurance fraud investigator will do that to you. My whole career was about finding logical explanations for what people claimed happened. I needed black and white evidence. Period. That's why what happened near Toquilma has bothered me for so long. I've tried to rationalize it, but I can't. I just can't. I'd been retired for about 8 months when Jack called about a camping trip. Jack, Al, and I have been friends since high school, all outdoorsmen with decades of wilderness experience. Jack's been a forest ranger for over 30 years, and Al spent most of his life as a hunting guide. These aren't guys who scare easily or misidentify wildlife. We planned a 4-day trip to a remote area near the California-Oregon border, south and east of Toquilma. It's beautiful country, but not heavily traveled, which is exactly what we wanted. Just 3 old friends, no cell phones, not that they'd work out there anyway, and nature. The first day went perfectly. We hiked about 7 miles to our campsite, a small clearing near a creek surrounded by thick forest and rocky outcroppings. The weather was warm but not hot, and we set up camp, fished a little, and caught enough trout for dinner. After cooking them over the fire and washing everything up, we broke out the scotch, lit our cigars and pipes, and started bullshitting about old times. It was around 9:30 when we heard it. I've heard coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, bears, all kinds of wildlife. This wasn't like any of those. It was a scream that came from somewhere above our camp, maybe up on the ridge. It started low and then rose to a pitch that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't an animal in pain or fighting. It was deliberate, like it was announcing itself. We all froze. Jack's eyes went wide, and Al immediately reached for his rifle. "What the hell was that?" I remember asking. Jack shook his head. "Not a cougar, not a bear." Al just stared into the darkness beyond our fire. Never heard anything like it. We sat there for about 10 minutes, all of us tense, just listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Then it came again, but lower on the ridge and much louder. It was the same scream, but this time it felt like it was directed at us, like whatever made that sound knew we were there and was telling us something. After that, the night went quiet. We stayed up another couple hours, keeping the fire going, talking in low voices. None of us wanted to admit we were spooked, but we definitely were. We finally turned in around midnight, but I doubt any of us slept well. I know I didn't. I kept thinking I heard heavy footsteps around the camp, but whenever I'd sit up to listen, there was nothing. The next morning was clear and sunny, which helped ease some of the tension from the night before. We made coffee and breakfast, trying to joke about what we'd heard. Jack suggested it might have been a sick elk. Al thought maybe a bear with something caught in its throat. I went along with it, but none of us really believed those explanations. Around mid-morning, Jack went to relieve himself in the brush about 30 yards from camp. When he came back, his face was pale. "Someone's watching us," he said quietly. Al and I both stopped what we were doing. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I was out there and I felt it, eyes on me. Then I heard footsteps, heavy ones, moving away. Whatever it was, it's big." We grabbed our binoculars and scanned the tree line, but didn't see anything unusual. Jack pointed to where he thought the sounds had come from, and we decided to check it out together. Safety in numbers and all that. We hadn't gone more than 50 yards when we heard it, something moving through the brush ahead of us. Not carefully either. This was powerful movement, breaking through the undergrowth at a speed that seemed impossible for the terrain. It was moving up the hill, and we could see branches swaying and small trees shaking as whatever it was pushed through. "There," Al pointed suddenly. "Did you see that?" I hadn't, but Jack nodded. "Too fast," he muttered. We tried to follow, but it was moving at a pace we couldn't hope to match. Every few seconds we'd see movement ahead, brush parting, tree limbs swaying. At one point, Al stopped dead in his tracks. "I saw it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Just for a second, looked like a man, but it wasn't. Too big, too fast." We kept trying to catch up, but it was useless. Whatever we were chasing was covering ground 3 times faster than we could, and in much rougher terrain. After about 15 minutes, we lost all signs of it and had to admit defeat. That's when the smell hit us. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, and something musky and wild. The stench was so powerful it made my eyes water. It hung in the air around us, strongest near a section of brush that had been disturbed. "Jesus Christ," Jack gagged. "What is that?" We didn't have an answer. We searched the area for tracks but found nothing conclusive. The ground was too rocky and dry to hold clear prints. What we did find were broken branches and disturbed vegetation, but the most unsettling thing was the height of some of the breaks. There were snapped branches a good 6 feet up, higher than any of us could reach without jumping. We headed back to camp, all of us on edge. Nobody wanted to say what we were thinking. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, we'd all heard the stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. But those were just stories, things to scare kids around campfires. I'd spent my entire career disproving things people swore were true. I wasn't about to start believing in monsters now, but I couldn't explain what we'd experienced either. We decided to pack up and move our camp about a mile down the creek. None of us suggested leaving entirely. I think we were all too curious, too stubborn, or maybe too proud to admit we were scared. But we did agree that sleeping somewhere else seemed like a good idea. The rest of the day passed without incident. We set up the new camp, fished a bit, and tried to relax. But the mood had changed. We kept scanning the tree line, jumping at sounds and speaking in lower voices. Even Al, who'd faced down charging bears and once survived being stalked by a mountain lion, seemed on edge. As evening approached, we built a bigger fire than usual. None of us said why, but we all knew we wanted light, and plenty of it. We'd just finished eating when Jack suddenly held up his hand for silence. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I caught it. A faint, rhythmic sound from the direction of our old campsite. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Moving slowly, deliberately. "It's checking out where we were," Al said quietly. We sat motionless, hardly breathing, as the sounds continued for several minutes. Then they stopped. The forest went silent again, that same unnatural quiet from the night before. We waited, tense, expecting to hear that scream again. Instead, there was a series of knocks, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a heavy stick. 3 distinct knocks, then silence. A minute later, from further away, 3 more knocks. "It's communicating," Jack said. His face looked ghostly in the firelight. "Or there's more than one." That thought hadn't occurred to me, and it sent a chill down my spine. One of these things was terrifying enough. The idea of multiple creatures out there, surrounding us, was almost too much. We stayed awake late into the night, keeping the fire built high. Around midnight, we heard movement in the brush about 50 yards from camp. Heavy footsteps circling our position, staying just out of the firelight. Occasionally, there would be a rustle or the snap of a twig, almost as if it wanted us to know it was there. I remember checking my watch at 2:15 in the morning when we heard the scream again. This time, it was much closer, maybe only 100 yards away. It was the same sound, starting low and rising to that bone-chilling pitch. All 3 of us were on our feet immediately, flashlights pointed in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing to see. For about 10 seconds after the scream, there was absolute silence, then an explosion of sound as something large crashed through the underbrush directly toward our camp. The speed was incredible. Whatever it was covered the distance in seconds. It stopped just outside the ring of firelight. We could hear it breathing, deep, heavy breaths. The smell was overwhelming now, that same putrid, musky odor. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice surprisingly steady. "We don't mean any harm." The only response was a low, rumbling growl that didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It was almost human, but too deep, too powerful. Al raised his rifle slowly. "I'm going to fire a warning shot," he said quietly. Before he could, there was a tremendous crash as something was thrown from the darkness and landed in the middle of our camp. It was a rock. No, more like a small boulder that must have weighed 40 pounds. It had been thrown with enough force to bury itself several inches in the soft ground. That was it for us. We grabbed our packs, left the tents and most of our gear, and got the hell out of there. We hiked through the night, using our flashlights, moving as fast as we could toward the trail that would lead us back to the car. Every few minutes, we'd hear movement in the woods around us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes on both sides. It was following us, pacing us. Just before dawn, as we reached the main trail, we heard that scream one last time, distant now, back in the direction we'd come from. It felt like a farewell, or a warning. We made it back to the car around 9 that morning and drove straight home. We didn't talk much during the drive. What was there to say? We'd experienced something none of us could explain. Later, when we finally discussed it, we agreed on a few things. Whatever we encountered wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't anything we could identify. It was intelligent, powerful, and deliberately intimidating us. I've tried to find rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of territorial bear behavior we hadn't seen before. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, though who would be out there to prank us, I have no idea. Maybe we all experienced some kind of shared hallucination from wild mushrooms that somehow got into our food. But I know what we experienced. I know what we heard, what we smelled, what we saw moving through those trees. I just don't have a name for it, or at least not one I'm comfortable using. I've never gone back to that area. Neither have Jack or Al. Some places you just learn to avoid, and some experiences you just learn to live with, even if you can never explain them. But I'll tell you this much, I don't laugh at Bigfoot stories anymore. Story 15. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to us last December. My wife thinks I should just let it go, but I can't. I need to put this out there and see if anyone else has experienced something similar. It was December of 2017, and we decided to get away for a week before Christmas. Just me, my wife Sarah, and our 2 kids, Emma 7 and Jake 5. I found this perfect little cabin near Wallowa Lake in northeastern Oregon. The pictures looked amazing, rustic but comfortable, surrounded by pine trees, sitting right at the edge of the forest, with an incredible view of the mountains. The owner said it was about a mile from the nearest neighbor, which sounded perfect. We wanted isolation, quiet, and family time. We arrived on a Monday afternoon. It had snowed the night before, so everything was covered in about 8 inches of fresh powder. The kids were ecstatic. The cabin was even better than the photos. 2 bedrooms, a loft, stone fireplace, and these huge windows facing the lake. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. That first day was exactly what we wanted. We built a snowman, went for a short hike along a marked trail, and spent the evening playing board games by the fire. The kids were exhausted and in bed by 8, and Sarah and I stayed up having wine and just enjoying the quiet. It was around 11 that first night when it happened. We were about to head to bed when there was this loud thump against the back wall of the cabin. It wasn't subtle. It was forceful enough that the framed landscape photo near the kitchen actually fell off the wall. Sarah jumped and grabbed my arm. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I told her it was probably just snow falling from the roof or a branch hitting the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and my jacket and went outside to check. It was freezing cold and completely silent. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, except for our footprints from earlier. I walked around the entire perimeter, shining my light into the trees, but saw nothing unusual. When I came back in, I assured Sarah it was nothing to worry about. The next day was normal. We drove into town for groceries, came back and made snow angels with the kids, and had another pleasant evening. I didn't mention the noise from the night before, and Sarah seemed to have forgotten about it. That second night, around midnight, we were both jolted awake by an even louder bang against the side of the cabin. This one was definitely not snow falling or a branch. It sounded deliberate, like someone had slammed something hard against the exterior wall. Right after, there was this scraping sound along the wall behind the kids' room. Sarah was terrified. "Mike, there's someone outside." I got up, grabbed my flashlight again, and this time took the baseball bat I'd brought along for the kids to play with. When I opened the front door, our 2 dogs, I forgot to mention we brought our golden retrievers, Max and Cooper, rushed past me, barking like crazy. They ran straight to the side of the cabin where we'd heard the noise. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I remember my breath making these thick clouds in the beam of my flashlight. I followed the dogs around to the side of the cabin where the kids' room was. The dogs were sniffing frantically at something in the snow. When I approached, I saw footprints, but not normal footprints. These were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and I wear a size 12. But it wasn't just the size that disturbed me. They were spaced unusually far apart, like whatever made them had an enormous stride. The prints led from the tree line directly to the cabin wall, then back into the forest. I tried telling myself it was just some local messing with us, but deep down I knew better. No human could make prints that large or spaced that far apart. I called the dogs back and hurried inside. Sarah was waiting by the door, hugging herself. What was it? I didn't want to scare her, so I just said, I found some animal tracks. Probably a deer or elk that had brushed against the cabin. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press it. We checked on the kids, who thankfully had slept through everything and eventually went back to bed. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. The next day, I was on edge. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the tree line. Sarah noticed and asked what was wrong, but I brushed it off, saying I was just tired. We stayed close to the cabin that day. I suggested we could drive into Joseph, the nearby town, for dinner, but Sarah wanted to cook the steaks we'd bought. That third night is when things got truly terrifying. We'd put the kids to bed around 8:30, and Sarah and I were watching a movie on my laptop. Around 1 in the morning, both dogs suddenly stood up from where they'd been sleeping by the fireplace. Their fur was raised along their backs, and they started growling, not barking, but this low, continuous growl that I'd never heard from them before. They both faced the front door, completely rigid. "What's wrong with them?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, there was a heavy thud against the front porch post. It wasn't like the previous noises. This was powerful enough that I felt the entire front section of the cabin shake. Then another impact hit the kitchen wall, and with it came this sound. A grunt or growl that didn't sound human, but it didn't sound fully animal either. I jumped up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. The motion sensor light on the porch had come on, illuminating the snow-covered yard, and that's when I saw it, a massive shadow moving past the edge of the porch. Whatever it was tall, walking upright, and bulky. It moved quickly into the darkness beyond the light's reach. "Mike, what is it?" Sarah was right behind me now, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Get the kids and bring them into our room." While she went to get Emma and Jake, I checked that all the windows and doors were locked. The dogs were going crazy now, running from window to window, growling and whining. We had just gotten the kids settled in our bedroom when it started. Systematic slapping sounds against the outer walls. They weren't random. They were deliberate, like open-handed smacks against the siding. The sound moved in a circle around the cabin. First the front wall, then the side, then the back, then the other side. Each impact was accompanied by this heavy, angry breathing or growling. Emma started crying, asking what was happening. Jake was silent, eyes wide with fear. Sarah held them both in the bed while I stood by the bedroom door, bat in hand, feeling completely helpless. What was I going to do if whatever was out there decided to come in? This continued for almost an hour, the methodical circling of the cabin, the slapping against the walls, the occasional grunt or growl. Sometimes there would be silence for a few minutes, and we'd think it was over, only for it to start again from a different direction. Around 2:30 in the morning, it finally stopped. The dogs eventually calmed down, though they remained alert, ears perked up at the slightest sound. None of us slept. We sat in that bedroom, lights on, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I cautiously opened the front door. The sight that greeted me made my stomach drop. The snow around the entire cabin was covered in those same massive footprints, some spaced so far apart it seemed impossible. They circled the entire property, coming close to every window and door. But what really chilled me to the bone was what I found on the small tool shed about 20 yards from the cabin. There were deep claw marks running up the outer planks, starting at about my eye level and extending up nearly 7 feet. I went back inside and told Sarah we were leaving. We didn't even take time to clean up or pack properly. We threw our stuff into bags, loaded the kids and dogs into the car, and were on the road within 30 minutes. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, what kind of creature would behave that way. It seemed so deliberate, so methodical in its intimidation. It wasn't just passing through, it was trying to frighten us, to drive us away. When we got home, I spent hours researching online. I found a few vague references to strange encounters in the Wallowa Lake area, but nothing widely confirmed. I even considered calling the cabin owner, but decided against it. What would I say? That I thought a Sasquatch had stalked our rental? It's been months now, and I still can't shake the memory of those footprints in the snow, the systematic way it circled our cabin, the impossible height of those claw marks. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories, but after what happened at Wallowa Lake, I'm convinced we encountered something that night. Something territorial, something intelligent, something that wanted us gone from its domain. I haven't told many people this story. Most would think I'm crazy or that I'm exaggerating, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt, and I'm never going back to Wallowa Lake again. Has anyone else experienced anything like this in northeastern Oregon? I need to know I'm not losing my mind. Story 16. I've been sitting on this experience for months now, not really sure if I should share it. Even typing this out makes my hands shake a little. I guess I just need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. I own a small repair shop about 20 miles north of Palm Springs, out in the high desert. Nothing fancy, just a converted garage where I fix motorcycles, ATVs, and the occasional car. Been doing it for about 6 years now. The shop sits on a piece of property that backs right up to open desert. Miles and miles of nothing but sand, scrub, and Joshua trees. That night started like any other. It was early October, around 10 o'clock, and I was finishing up with a Kawasaki that needed carburetor work. The customer was coming by first thing in the morning, so I'd stayed late to make sure everything was good to go. The night was quiet, just the occasional coyote in the distance and the soft hum of my shop lights. I locked up the main building and headed toward my old Volkswagen Bug, parked in the gravel lot. It's not much, but it gets me around. The temperature had dropped like it always does in the desert at night, maybe 55 degrees, and there was a slight breeze. I remember pulling my jacket tighter as I walked to the car. When I got in, I immediately turned the heater on, though it barely works. I backed out of my usual spot and swung the car around to face the exit, which points straight into the open desert. That's when my headlights hit it. About 40 feet ahead, directly in the beam of my lights, stood something I still struggle to explain. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A hiker maybe, or someone who'd wandered off the trail, but within seconds I knew it wasn't human, not even close. This thing stood upright on 2 legs, towering at what had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in light tan hair, almost the color of the surrounding sand, but slightly darker. The hair wasn't shaggy like you see in those Bigfoot documentaries. It was more like a short, dense coat that moved slightly in the breeze. I froze completely. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The creature didn't move either. It just stood there, facing my direction. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could tell it was looking right at me. Its head seemed proportionally smaller than its massive body, with a slightly conical shape on top. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably just 7 or 8 seconds. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, stupidly, I reached down and flicked on my high beams, hoping to get a better look. My bug's lights aren't great, but I thought they might show me more details. That was when things got even weirder. The moment the lights brightened, the creature reacted. It took 2 massive steps backward, but not like a person would step. It was almost like it glided backward, its feet barely seeming to leave the ground. Then it took 1 step sideways to my left. The movements were fluid and eerily silent. No sound of footsteps, no crunch of gravel or brush. And then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness beyond my headlights. I sat there, engine idling, completely unable to move. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard I could feel it in my ears. I couldn't even think straight. What the hell had I just seen? After a few minutes, pure fear took over. I slammed the car into gear and floored it down the dirt driveway, skidding onto the main road. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, convinced that thing was following me. My little bug couldn't go faster than 65, and I had it maxed out the entire way. I live about 15 minutes from the shop, but that night it felt like hours. I have a 45 in my glove compartment, legal and registered. I've had it for years, mostly for rattlesnakes around the shop. But when I saw that creature, it never even occurred to me to reach for it. Something deep inside told me that would have been the worst possible move. Looking back, I'm certain that gun would have been useless anyway. This thing was massive. Its chest was literally as wide as a refrigerator. I'm not exaggerating. Its arms hung down below its waist, possibly to its knees, and they were thick, not lanky like a person's arms, but heavily muscled. When I got home, I double-locked everything and kept all the lights on. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone in a costume, but the way it moved was impossible for a human. The silent, fluid motion, the incredible height and bulk. No costume could replicate that. For the next week, I opened and closed the shop during daylight hours only. I even considered selling the place. But it's my livelihood. I've put everything into that business. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? A giant, hairy creature in the California desert. It sounded ridiculous even to me, and I'm the one who saw it. But after about 2 weeks of barely sleeping and jumping at shadows, I cautiously mentioned something to Miguel, an old-timer who runs the gas station down the road. I was careful how I phrased it. "Hey, Miguel, you ever hear about people seeing strange things out in the desert at night, like really tall figures?" The way he looked at me made my blood run cold. He didn't laugh or ask what I'd been smoking. He just nodded slowly and said, "You saw the Yucca Man, didn't you? I nearly dropped my coffee." "The what?" "Yucca Man. That's what the locals call him. Been around these parts for decades. Most folks who've been here long enough know someone who's seen him." Miguel told me that sightings go back to at least the 1970s. The military bases nearby, Joshua Tree and 29 Palms, have had numerous reports from Marines on guard duty. Sometimes it's described as a massive, hairy humanoid. Other times, people just experience overwhelming dread and the sensation of being watched. "Why doesn't anyone talk about this?" I asked him. Miguel just shrugged. "Who wants to be the crazy person talking about desert Bigfoot? Around here, you see something like that. You keep it to yourself unless you're talking to someone who already knows." Over the next few weeks, I started asking around very carefully. What shocked me was how many people nodded knowingly when I brought it up indirectly. A local ranger admitted they get several reports a year, but don't document them officially. A bartender in Yucca Valley told me her father had seen it 3 times during his 30 years working at the Marine base. The more I learned, the more I realized there's an unspoken agreement in these communities. Everyone knows something strange roams the high desert, but nobody wants to be labeled the town kook by talking about it openly. I've been back to my shop countless times since that night, but I never stay after dark anymore. I've installed more lights in the parking area and even set up motion-activated cameras, though they've never caught anything unusual. I still carry my 45, but I don't kid myself that it would make any difference. What bothers me most is that I can't explain what I saw. I've always been a practical person. I fix things for a living. I understand how machines work, how parts fit together. But there's no logical explanation for what stood in front of my car that night. The size alone was impossible. The chest was enormous, like I said, refrigerator wide. The shoulders were rounded and sloped, not square like a human's. And the way it moved, that silent, graceful backward step that covered at least 6 feet in a single motion. No human can move like that. I've tried researching desert Bigfoot sightings online, and there are surprisingly many reports from this region. They call it different names: Yucca Man, the Desert Sasquatch, the Sandman. The descriptions match what I saw: tall, muscular, light-colored hair, silent movement. One detail that stands out in many accounts is the feeling of dread that accompanies sightings. That's something I experienced too, not just normal fear, but a deep, primal panic that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was seeing, like my brain couldn't process it properly. The strangest part? I sometimes feel drawn back to that spot. Not in a way that makes me want to go there at night, hell no, but I find myself wondering if it's still out there, if it remembers me, if our paths will cross again. It's like some weird connection was formed in those few seconds we stared at each other. I still haven't told my family, or most of my friends. My girlfriend noticed I was acting strange for weeks afterward, but I just blamed it on stress from work. How do you tell someone you saw a creature that shouldn't exist, that there's something roaming the desert that defies explanation? So now I'm here, telling strangers on the internet instead. Maybe someone reading this has seen it too. Maybe someone has answers. Or maybe I just needed to get this off my chest so I can try to move on with my life. All I know for certain is what I saw that night was real. The Yucca Man exists, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. And sometimes, late at night when the wind blows across the desert and makes the Joshua trees sway, I swear I can feel it out there, watching and waiting in the darkness beyond the lights. Story 17. Mudgeons. I've never told this story online before. I've barely told it to anyone except my therapist, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. It happened in '96 when I was 14, and to this day I still have nightmares about it. My parents and I were staying at Deadwood Reservoir in Idaho that October. Dad worked for a logging company that was clearing some land near an old abandoned mining town. The company had set up a base camp, and since Dad was one of the supervisors, we got to bring our fifth-wheel trailer and stay on site. Mom thought it would be a nice family adventure while Dad worked. I was actually pretty excited because the trip coincided with the opening of deer hunting season, and Dad had promised I could go out on my own for the first time. The morning it happened was crisp and cold, that perfect fall weather where you can see your breath hanging in the air. I remember putting on my orange vest and hat, checking my rifle at least 3 times, and feeling so grown up as Dad reminded me about gun safety before I headed out. I'd been deer hunting with him since I was 10, but this was my first solo trip. Mom packed me a lunch: turkey sandwich, apple, and those chocolate chip cookies she always made that got all melty in the middle. I remember all these little details so clearly, but I wish I didn't. I planned to cross the Deadwood River. It was shallow enough to wade across that time of year and climb up the hillside on the other side. Dad had mentioned there was a good vantage point up there where I might spot some deer coming to the water. He told me that the helicopter pilots from the logging company had a small camp not far from there, so I should keep that in mind when I was scanning the area. The hike up was uneventful. My boots were still damp from crossing the river, and they made this squelching sound with every step. I reached the spot Dad had described after about 40 minutes of climbing. It was perfect. A small clearing with a fallen log I could sit on, giving me a clear view of a section of the river below and part of the surrounding forest. I settled in, rifle across my lap, binoculars around my neck, and started scanning for deer. After about an hour of nothing but squirrels and birds, I was getting bored. I ate half my sandwich and kept looking through my binoculars. That's when I noticed something moving along the riverbank, maybe 300 yards away. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd been warned there were black bears in the area. It was dark-colored and big, moving through the trees near the water. I remember feeling a spike of excitement because even if it wasn't a deer, seeing a bear would be a cool story to tell when I got back to camp. But as I focused my binoculars, something felt wrong. The way it moved wasn't right for a bear. Bears have this swaying gait when they walk upright, kind of awkward and unbalanced. This thing was walking smoothly, purposefully, like a person, but not. It was tall, much taller than my dad, who's 6'1", and completely covered in dark hair or fur. I lowered my binoculars for a second, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, it had stopped moving and was standing perfectly still by the river's edge. And then it turned. It turned and looked directly up the hill, directly at me. I can't explain the fear that hit me in that moment. It wasn't like being scared of a horror movie, or even like the time I got lost in the woods when I was 8. This was primal. Every cell in my body screamed, danger. My mouth went completely dry, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like something ancient in my brain recognized a predator my conscious mind couldn't comprehend. Through the binoculars, I could see it was covered in dark, almost black hair from head to toe. The face was, I don't even know how to describe it, not quite human, not quite animal. The eyes were deep set under a heavy brow, and they were staring right at me. I swear it knew I was watching it. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it started moving. Toward me, not rushing, but deliberate. Like it had all the time in the world to reach me. That broke my paralysis. I dropped the binoculars, grabbed my rifle and ran. I didn't even think about shooting. All I could think was run, get away. I scrambled down the hillside, slipping and sliding on pine needles and loose dirt. Branches whipped my face, but I barely felt them. I fell twice, banging my knee badly the second time, but the pain didn't register through the adrenaline. When I reached the river, I splashed across without caring how deep it was. Water soaked my jeans up to my thighs, but I kept going. I could swear I felt something behind me, watching, following. The weight of its gaze was like a physical thing on my back. I finally reached our trailer, fumbled with the door handle, and practically fell inside. I slammed the door shut, locked it, then went around closing all the blinds and curtains. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the cord for the blinds. I sat on the floor, back against the door, hugging my rifle, which I'd never unloaded. Dad was furious about that later, and tried not to make a sound. Mom and Dad were both at the main camp with the logging crew. I was completely alone, and I was convinced that thing was out there, watching the trailer, waiting. I stayed there for hours, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. When I finally heard Dad's truck pull up outside, I nearly cried with relief. They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. Dad thought I'd seen a bear and panicked, or maybe one of the helicopter pilots walking along the river in dark clothing. Mom was just upset I'd tracked mud and water all over the trailer's carpet. I tried to explain the way it moved, how tall it was, the way it looked at me, but the words sounded hollow and childish even to my own ears. I refused to leave the trailer for the rest of the trip. I faked being sick, claimed my knee hurt too much from the fall, anything to avoid going back outside. Dad was disappointed I was letting a bear scare ruin my first hunting trip, but he didn't force me. 2 days later, Dad came back to the trailer looking troubled. He and some of the crew had been checking out an old boarding house from the mining days, about a mile from our camp. In what was once the basement, they'd found what looked like some kind of nest. Dad described it as being made of evergreen boughs and forest debris piled together, with the floor all around it matted down like something heavy had been lying there repeatedly. He said there was a smell in there like nothing he'd ever encountered before, musky and wild, but not like any animal he knew. That same night, one of the water truck drivers quit on the spot. He'd been filling his truck at the river around 3 in the morning when he saw something watching him from across the water. He described a tall, dark figure with eyes very high off the ground. He left his truck running, lights on, and drove his personal vehicle straight back to town without even collecting his things from the crew quarters. A few days later, the logging boss and his 2 sons came running into camp. They'd been marking trees up on the hillside, the same one I'd been on, when something started chasing them. They didn't get a clear look at it, but they heard it breaking branches behind them and making these strange screaming sounds that weren't human or any animal they recognized. We left the next day. Dad said the job was being postponed due to equipment issues. But I overheard him telling Mum that half the crew was refusing to go back into those woods. I was so relieved to be going home, I didn't even care about missing more school. Months later, Dad mentioned he'd talked to some hunters who'd been in the Deadwood area that fall. They all had similar stories. Strange smells in the woods, feeling watched. Places where the forest would go completely silent, not even birds making noise. One guy described setting up his tent, then getting this overwhelming feeling of dread so intense, he packed up and drove 3 hours back home in the middle of the night, rather than stay there. I'm 37 now. I've been hunting many times since then, all over Idaho, and even in Montana and Wyoming. I've seen bears, mountain lions, all kinds of wildlife. Nothing has ever made me feel the way that thing at Deadwood did, the absolute certainty that I was being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, something that knew exactly what I was and where I was going. I still can't explain what I saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then, seen the TV shows, all that stuff. Some of the descriptions match what I saw, but none of them capture the feeling, that bone-deep instinctive terror. Like looking into the eyes of something that existed before humans did, something that remembers when we were prey. I've never gone back to Deadwood Reservoir. I never will. Whatever was living in that abandoned mining town, whatever made that nest and chased people through those woods, it's welcome to keep that place. Some territories aren't meant for us to claim. The Beast in Story 18. Assume I still get sweaty palms typing this, even though it's been years since it happened. I've never shared this story online before, but after coming across similar experiences on here, I think it's time. Maybe someone will believe me, or even better, maybe someone can explain what happened to me and my friends outside Libby, Montana. It all started back in September of 2005. I was 15, just starting my sophomore year of high school. My friends and I had this brilliant idea to hike out to this abandoned cabin about 3 miles from town near the Kootenai River. There were 5 of us: me, Emma, Jake, Michelle, Tyler, and Casey. We'd heard about this cabin from some seniors who said it was a cool place to hang out. Nothing creepy about it at first. Just an old hunting cabin that nobody used anymore. We packed some snacks, flashlights, and Tyler even brought his dad's old Polaroid camera. Looking back, it was pretty stupid heading out so late in the day. By the time we got within sight of the cabin, the sun was already setting. The sky had that weird orangey-purple color, and the shadows were getting longer by the minute. I remember being out of breath because I was trying to keep up with Tyler and Casey, who were way ahead of us. They were always competitive about everything. Michelle, Jake, and I were lagging behind, talking about some stupid drama at school. I was in the middle of telling them about Ms. Peterson's ridiculous math test when we heard it. This scream? No, more like a yelp. Then Tyler and Casey came tearing back down the trail toward us, their faces white as sheets. They practically knocked us over as they rushed past, yelling something about getting to the cabin now. We all started running, though I had no idea what we were running from. When we finally reached the cabin porch, Tyler and Casey were already inside, slamming the door behind them. We piled in after them, and Jake immediately started asking what the hell was going on. We saw something. Casey said, her voice shaking. She wasn't the type to get scared easily. She was on the softball team, and usually the toughest one in our group. What? Like a bear? Michelle asked, already looking like she regretted coming. Tyler shook his head. No way. It was standing up. Tall, like really tall. It had dark hair all over, Casey added. And it moved. Wrong. Like too fast. It crossed the trail maybe 50 feet ahead of us and disappeared into the trees. I remember feeling this cold tingle down my spine. I'd grown up in Montana my whole life, and we all knew what wildlife was around these parts. Bears, mountain lions, elk, but nothing that matched what they were describing. The cabin was cold and dusty inside. It was just one room with some broken furniture and old beer cans scattered around. Clearly the seniors weren't the only ones who came out here. There was a weird smell too, musty, but also something else I couldn't place. We stayed there for maybe an hour, keeping our voices low, everyone jumping at every creak or sound from outside. Eventually, Jake convinced us we needed to head back before it got completely dark. Nobody argued. The hike back was tense. Nobody talked much. We stuck together in a tight group, and I kept looking over my shoulder. We didn't see anything else that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. I didn't think much about it after a few weeks passed. We all just kind of didn't talk about it. I figured Tyler and Casey had seen a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe even a person hiking who'd spooked them. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't have reacted that way to something normal. Then, about 6 months later, in March, everything changed. I was staying over at my friend Sheila's house. She lived a few miles outside town in the same general area as that cabin, but closer to the main road. Her family had this big property that backed up against a field that eventually turned into the same woods where the cabin was. It was a Friday night, and we were bored out of our minds. Sheila's parents had gone to bed early, and we were sitting in her room listening to music and flipping through magazines. Around 11 at night, Sheila suggested we go outside and look at the stars. It was a clear night, and living out in the country meant you could see practically every star in the sky. So we grabbed our jackets, it was still pretty cold in Montana in March, and slipped out the back door. We walked to the edge of her yard, where this big field started. The grass was tall, maybe waist-high in some spots, and there were these little clusters of trees scattered throughout. The moon was bright enough that we could see without flashlights. We'd been out there maybe 15 minutes just talking and looking up at the sky when I first heard it. This breathing sound, heavy, wet-sounding breaths with this occasional snorting noise. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then Sheila grabbed my arm. She'd heard it too. "What is that?" she whispered, her fingers digging into my arm. I shook my head, straining to hear better. It was coming from the tall grass, maybe 30 feet away from us, just standing there, breathing. Then it moved. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. The grass parting, and then these heavy footsteps, but not like an animal on 4 legs. This was the sound of something big walking on 2 feet. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate for a person. "Emma," Sheila whispered, her voice barely audible, "we need to go back, now." We started backing up slowly toward her house, not wanting to make any sudden movements. That's when the breathing changed. It got faster, more aggressive, and then it started moving toward us, fast. Whatever it was running at us through that tall grass. On 2 feet, we turned and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, and I could hear Sheila sobbing as we sprinted across her yard. The worst part was knowing it was gaining on us. I could hear it getting closer, this heavy thudding of feet, and this weird guttural sound it was making. We reached her back door and practically fell inside, slamming it shut behind us. Sheila locked it immediately, and we stood there in her kitchen, gasping for air, listening. It was outside, pacing. We could hear it moving around the house, these heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway, then on the grass, circling. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. It was like something rotting, like Roadkill that's been baking in the summer sun for days. It was so strong it seemed to seep in through the walls. "What is it?" Sheila whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What the hell is it?" I couldn't answer. I was frozen, my mind racing back to what Tyler and Casey had seen 6 months earlier. Was this the same thing? Then it started hitting the walls, not like scratching, like it was pounding with its fists. Thump, thump. The whole house seemed to shake. Sheila's parents somehow slept through it. Their bedroom was on the opposite side of the house, and her dad always took sleeping pills. We huddled together in the kitchen, too terrified to move, as it moved around the house. The thumping stopped for a minute, and we thought maybe it had given up. Then Sheila screamed. It was at her window, the kitchen window, just staring in. The blinds were mostly closed, but through the slats I could see a dark shape and what looked like eyes reflecting the dim light from the stove hood. Not animal eyes. They were set too far apart, too high up on the window. I yanked Sheila away from the window, and we ran to her room, locking the door behind us. We pushed her dresser in front of the door and huddled on her bed, wrapped in blankets, despite being drenched in sweat. The thing stayed outside for what felt like hours. We could hear it moving around, occasionally hitting the walls. Sometimes it would go quiet for so long that we thought it was gone, only to hear a sudden thump against the side of the house that made us jump. It wasn't until the sky started lightening that the sounds finally stopped. We stayed in her room until well after sunrise, too scared to come out. When we finally did, Sheila's parents were up making coffee, completely oblivious to what had happened. We went outside later that morning, after her parents left to run errands. We found these weird impressions in the gravel driveway, not quite footprints, but areas where the rocks had been displaced in a pattern. And there were scratches on the siding of the house, about 7 feet up, way too high for any normal animal. I never told my parents about what happened. What would I even say? But about a week later, I overheard my mum talking to another parent about a girl named Jessica, who lived a few miles from Sheila. Apparently Jessica had been camping in a trailer at the edge of those same woods, and something had shaken her trailer so violently in the middle of the night that it nearly tipped over. Whatever it was had also scratched at the metal siding so hard it left deep grooves. Everyone said it must have been a bear, but Jessica swore up and down that she'd heard it walking around on 2 feet and making sounds no bear could make. I've tried to convince myself over the years that it was just some weird animal, maybe a bear with some kind of deformity that made it walk on its hind legs more often. But deep down, I know that's not it. Whatever was outside Sheila's house that night, whatever Tyler and Casey saw by the cabin, whatever terrorized Jessica in her trailer, it was the same creature. Something that walks on 2 feet, makes sounds no known animal makes, leaves behind a horrible rotting smell, and seems specifically interested in humans. I'm 27 now, and I still won't go camping. I moved away from Libby after high school and have only been back to visit a handful of times. Sheila still lives there, and she refuses to talk about that night. The few times I've brought it up, she just shakes her head and changes the subject. I still don't know what it was. Maybe I never will, but I know what I heard and what I saw, and I know that there's something out there in those woods that science can't explain. And the thought that it's still out there, possibly watching other hikers or teenagers hanging out near that old cabin, keeps me up at night more often than I'd like to admit.